The night always begins with a whisper. Not loud, not demanding, just a hush that seems to arrive from some far-off corner of memory. That's how this story starts too. Not with urgency, but with quiet wonder. Imagine the world just before sleep, when thoughts loosen their grip, when the edges of reality blur into dream. That's where we begin. And before I tell you more, I want to pause to say something important. We care about you deeply. Whoever you are, wherever you are, you're not alone in this moment. We truly mean that. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now grab your coffee or maybe your tea. Let your shoulders soften. And let's begin together. Rick Sanchez's story has been told in many ways, but tonight it isn't the explosions or the science or the laughter that matters. Tonight we move through a different door, the one that opens softly into memory. Long before the cynical grin, before the endless inventions and mistakes, before the multiverse spun itself into his palms, there was simply a boy. And this boy woke one morning to a strange silence that would anchor itself in him forever. The silence wasn't empty. It had texture, like soft velvet pressing gently on the skin of his thoughts. It wasn't frightening. It was comforting, even though he didn't understand it. That morning, the sun rose in his small, unremarkable world, and yet Rick noticed something different. The dust motes hung in the air longer. The shadows on the wall curved into shapes he didn't remember seeing before. In that strangeness, he found the first seed of what would one day grow into the restless, aching curiosity that defined his life. He was young, so young that his hands were still small enough to clutch stones and imagine them as planets. He would line them up on the wooden floor, whispering their names under his breath. But that morning, one stone seemed warmer than the rest, as though it had held a secret. He picked it up and felt the tiniest vibration. No one else noticed. To the world, it was just a stone. But to him, it was the first whisper of a universe that would someday open wide and never let him go. Rick didn't speak of it to his parents. They wouldn't have understood. Instead, he kept it tucked in a small box beneath his bed, along with a folded scrap of paper where he'd drawn a map of stars. He didn't know the names of the constellations yet, but he named them anyway, giving them titles that mattered only to him. The Silent Watcher, the Lullaby, the Hidden Smile. He didn't need accuracy. He needed intimacy, the kind of closeness a child feels when looking at the sky and believing it's speaking directly to him. Nights were his favorite. When the house grew still and his parents' voices softened in other rooms, he would press his cheek against the cool window glass and watch the stars. He imagined they were breathing with him, slowly, steadily, like companions sharing a bedtime rhythm. That rhythm soothed him, though it also stirred a longing he couldn't explain. It wasn't just wonder. It was a strange mixture of sadness and comfort, as though he already knew that beauty and loss would always walk side by side in his life. Sometimes, when he felt this longing too strongly, he would hum softly. No words, no melody he'd been taught, just a sound that rose and fell like a tide. That hum became a lullaby he carried through the years, one he would later hear in echoes, when Unity's voice touched his mind across galaxies. But here, in this beginning, it was only a boy's instinct to soothe himself, to cradle the ache of a heart that already felt too large for the world around him. The neighbors thought Rick was odd. He didn't run or shout like the other children. He often sat in the grass, plucking blades one by one, and arranging them into patterns that only he seemed to understand. He wasn't lonely, though. He felt accompanied by something unseen. At times he would close his eyes and sense a presence, not a figure, not a face, but a kind of warmth, like being watched over by someone who didn't need to be visible to be real. This presence whispered to him through the silence. It said without words that he was meant to see more, to feel more, to carry more, and so his quirks grew into habits. His parents didn't know what to make of it, but they didn't try too hard to change him. They left him mostly alone, which gave him the space to nurture his quiet rituals. Every evening he would build little universes out of whatever he found, rocks, bottle caps, scraps of metal. He arranged them on the floor like miniature galaxies. Then he would lean close, close enough that his breath stirred the tiny worlds, and he would whisper secrets into them. "You'll be okay," he would tell them. "You'll grow, you'll shine. You'll find your way." He didn't realize that he was really speaking to himself. The stone in the box remained his anchor. On especially restless nights, When the ache of his longing felt unbearable, he would hold it tightly in his palm. Its vibration soothed him. Whether it was truly alive or simply his imagination didn't matter. What mattered was that it listened. And perhaps in some hidden corner of the multiverse, the stone was listening, storing away the voice of a child who would one day grow into a man both brilliant and broken. Looking back, it's easy to see how those early moments shaped him. The silence, the star maps, the hum of his lullaby, the stone's quiet vibration, all of these became threads in the fabric of Rick Sanchez. They didn't erase his pain or shield him from the mistakes he would make, but they gave him a foundation of wonder, a softness that never fully left, even when buried beneath cynicism and alcohol and sarcasm. It's strange, isn't it, how the smallest details of childhood echo through an entire life. A whisper at the right moment, a secret stone, a song hummed in the dark. These become the anchors that steady us, even when we don't realize it. Rick carried these anchors, though he often pretended not to, and perhaps that is why years later an episode of his story could hit so deeply for fans. Because beneath the chaos and the science and the laughter, there was always this, an origin not of explosions but of whispers. An origin made of silence, longing, and gentle wonder. As we close this first chapter, let us breathe with Rick as he once breathed with the stars. Slow, steady, soft. Let us hum with him the lullaby without words. And let us remember that every story worth telling begins not with answers, but with questions whispered into the night. So rest now. The journey has only just begun. There are certain sounds that never leave us. For Rick, it was the sound of his own humming in the dark, the quiet vibrations of the stone in his palm, and the creak of floorboards that sang under his small feet. Childhood is often remembered in flashes, not timelines, and Rick's childhood lived more in impressions than in clear events. He carried those impressions like echoes, soft ripples in the lake of memory that would one day shape the man he became. The boy grew up in a house that was both familiar and distant. His parents were there, but not always present. Their voices often passed each other like ships in fog, crossing without touching. Rick learned early that silence could be more honest than words. He wasn't ignored exactly, but neither was he truly seen. That perhaps is why he listened so carefully to the quiet things. Stones that hummed, shadows that leaned, stars that blinked as if in rhythm with his pulse. He heard meaning where others heard nothing. Sometimes, though, even he longed for connection. He had a cousin who visited once in a while, a boy with quick laughter and quick hands, who tried to drag Rick into games of tag or wrestling. Rick would try half-heartedly, but his mind was always elsewhere. He would glance toward the sky, distracted by the slow curl of a cloud, or notice the way a bird tilted its head, and in those moments he would drift away. His cousin never understood. He teased Rick, called him odd, but Rick didn't mind. Oddness felt like a secret strength, though he didn't yet know how to wield it. What Rick did love, however, was small experiments. Long before the portals, long before machines that bent reality, he tinkered with scraps in his room. A broken clock, a battery stolen from a flashlight, wires twisted together without purpose. These were his treasures. He had no teacher, no mentor to guide his hands. He learned by listening not to adults, but to the materials themselves. He claimed they spoke to him not in words but in rhythms. A gear wanted to turn, a wire wanted to connect, a spark wanted to leap. And Rick listened, he obeyed. He coaxed them into little dances of cause and effect. One evening when the rest of the house had gone quiet, he managed to light a tiny bulb using nothing but scraps. It glowed faintly, barely alive, but to Rick it was proof of something vast. He sat in the dim room, clutching the warm bulb, feeling as though he had caught a star. His parents never knew. No one praised him or marveled at his discovery. But Rick didn't need applause. What he needed was wonder, and wonder was enough. Still, even wonder can feel lonely when not shared. Rick began talking to the stone again, this time telling it about his experiments. He confessed his failures, his successes, his dreams of one day building something so vast the stars themselves would have to notice. The stone never answered, but it didn't need to. Its vibration, or the imagined vibration of his own hope, reminded him that he wasn't entirely alone. He carried it with him everywhere, hidden in his pocket during the day, tucked beneath his pillow at night. As he grew, the world around him grew sharper. School wasn't kind to children like him. Teachers saw his distracted gaze and labeled him unfocused. Classmates noticed his silence and called him strange. Rick didn't fight back, but inside he built walls. He smiled less, spoke less, but dreamed more. He drew maps of impossible worlds in the margins of his notebooks. He sketched machines he didn't know how to build yet. His imagination grew faster than his reality could hold. One teacher, though, noticed something. She was older, with kind eyes and a patience that most adults lacked. She once lingered at his desk after class, tapping a finger gently against his notebook. "These are stars?" she asked. He nodded. "They're beautiful," she said softly, as if speaking to a friend, not a student. That single word, beautiful, burned into him. It was the first time someone had seen the shape of his mind and not dismissed it. That teacher didn't stay in his life long, but her presence lingered like a candle in a dark room. Sometimes one small light is enough to change the way you walk through the night. Rick began to crave more of that recognition, though he rarely found it. Instead, he turned inward, building stories in his head to comfort himself. He imagined companions, voices that would laugh at his jokes, hands that would help him assemble impossible things, friends who understood his silence. Perhaps, in some fractured way, this was the beginning of his fascination with creating worlds, with designing companions, with seeking unity in ways others could not understand. He didn't know it then, but the loneliness of those years carved a space in him that would never fully close. That space became both his gift and his wound. It gave him vision, because only those who ache deeply notice the subtleties of existence, but it also left him perpetually unsatisfied. Nothing in the real world ever seemed to fill that emptiness fully. At night, when he pressed his ear to the window and listened to the stars, he began to whisper questions instead of lullabies. "Why am I here? What do you want from me? Will I always feel this way?" The stars didn't answer, but he imagined they pulsed brighter for a moment, as if acknowledging his voice. That was enough to keep him asking, enough to keep him searching. Sometimes his cousin or classmates would laugh at him for staring into the sky. "There's nothing up there," they'd say. But Rick knew better. There was everything up there. And somewhere deep inside he knew that one day he would find a way to prove it. But proof was far away. For now there was only a boy, a humming stone, scraps of experiments and echoes of loneliness softened by wonder. These echoes shaped him, stitched him together even as they left loose threads. His childhood was not loud, not full of adventures others would write down. Instead, it was quiet, peculiar, threaded with absence and longing. And perhaps that is why, years later, audiences felt so deeply when his pain finally surfaced. They recognized in him something familiar, the ache of being misunderstood, the beauty of small discoveries, the weight of growing up with more questions than answers. And so, as the boy drifted toward adolescence, the echoes of childhood followed him. The hum of his lullaby, the warmth of the bulb he once lit, the whisper of the stars. These echoes would never fade. They would become his compass, his burden, his hidden song. For now, let us rest with him in that in-between place, where a child's hands are too small for the vastness of his dreams, and yet somehow still cradle them tenderly. Let us breathe with him, slow and steady as he hums himself to sleep once more. Because every great journey begins not with power or glory, but with the simple ache of a child who wants to understand the silence. Adolescence has a way of reshaping everything. Faces, voices, even the way the world feels beneath one's feet. For Rick, it reshaped the echoes of his childhood into something sharper, more insistent. The hum of the stone was still with him, tucked in his pocket like a secret heartbeat. But now there were new hums, the whir of small machines he began to build, the low buzz of fluorescent classroom lights, and the restless thrum of questions that no one seemed prepared to answer. He was taller now, his shoulders carrying both the awkwardness of youth and the beginnings of something else, a quiet defiance. Where other children grew into sports or laughter-filled groups, Rick grew into solitude. Not because he didn't crave company, but because the company he found rarely knew how to sit inside his silences. He was a boy caught between wanting to belong and knowing he never fully would. That contradiction became his quiet companion. School had become less forgiving. Teachers mistook his drifting gaze for laziness, his odd comments for arrogance. The more they misunderstood him, the more he pulled inward, and yet the more his mind expanded outward, stretching far beyond the walls of the classroom. His notebooks no longer contained only idle sketches of stars. They brimmed with equations he barely understood, circuit diagrams borrowed from half-read textbooks, and strange ideas for devices that no adult would ever take seriously. He was, in a way, already living in two worlds, the one his body occupied and the one his mind was tirelessly building. It was around this time that Rick discovered the thrill of sparks. Not metaphorical sparks, but literal ones, tiny flashes that leapt when he wired metal to metal, when he twisted copper strands together and watched energy dance. These sparks were alive in a way words never were. They didn't judge him, didn't call him strange. They simply responded to his touch, to his patience. For the first time, he felt in control of something vast, something that hummed back at him like the stone once had. In the garage of his family's house, dusty and cluttered, Rick built his sanctuary. Old appliances, discarded radios, broken televisions, all became his raw materials. He scavenged without shame, seeing potential in what others had abandoned. Slowly, his sanctuary filled with the smell of solder and the faint crackle of static. This was no longer just tinkering. This was a boy carving his first true language, a language spoken in voltage and vibration. Sometimes, late at night, his mother would find him asleep at his workbench, cheek pressed to a notebook stained with graphite and grease. She would sigh, cover him with a blanket, and leave quietly. She didn't understand what he was doing, but she understood he needed it. And though she rarely said the words, her quiet acts of care built a thread of trust Rick held onto. Even when other parts of his family frayed, adolescence also brought with it something new, friendships that could have been but never fully were. There were classmates who admired his cleverness in science projects, who laughed at his dry remarks, who sometimes invited him to join their games or groups. Yet Rick always hesitated. He would begin to step forward, then retreat, sensing the unspoken distance between himself and them. They wanted lightness, but Rick carried gravity. They wanted chatter, but Rick preferred silence that spoke. And so he learned the art of half-belonging, close enough to feel the warmth, distant enough to preserve the fragile spark of his own wonder. Still, he wasn't entirely alone. The teacher with kind eyes had left, but a new figure arrived, a mentor of sorts, though not in any official sense. An older neighbor, a retired engineer who noticed Rick rummaging through discarded metal one afternoon. Instead of scolding him, the man asked what he was building. Rick, cautious at first, mumbled about circuits. To his surprise, the man smiled and offered him an old soldering kit. "Every builder needs proper tools," he said. That moment, so small, so ordinary, lit something in Rick. It was the rare validation he craved, the acknowledgement that what he was doing mattered. The neighbor didn't hover or lecture. He simply checked in now and then, answering questions, pointing out safer ways to wire or solder, sometimes sharing stories of machines that once hummed under his care. Rick listened, hungry, absorbing everything. The world of sparks was expanding, and now it had a guide. Yet, as always, joy carried its shadow. For every invention that worked, there were 10 that failed. For every spark that leapt, there were wires that burned or circuits that collapsed. Rick, impatient by nature, would sometimes hurl pieces across the garage, his frustration echoing through the night. And afterward, when the anger drained, he would sit quietly, stone in hand, whispering to it as though confessing. The stone, unyielding as ever, listened without reply. Its silence was not cruel. It was steady. In its steadiness, Rick found the will to try again. It was during this period that Rick built his first machine that truly startled him. A crude thing, made of spare parts, wires spilling like vines. But when he flipped the switch, it emitted a hum that seemed almost alive. Not just noise, but resonance. Low and steady, vibrating through his chest like the lullaby he once hummed to himself as a child. He sat frozen, listening, convinced for a moment that the machine was speaking back. It wasn't language, not really. It was something deeper, acknowledgement. In that instant, he felt both infinite and impossibly small. Here was proof, at last, that the world held secrets waiting to be unlocked, that his loneliness was not for nothing, that somewhere in the hum of circuits and stars, he might one day find answers, and yet he knew, without knowing how, that this path would not be gentle. Wonder always carries weight. Curiosity always exacts a price. He could feel it already, in the restless nights, in the distance growing between him and those who didn't understand. He was becoming someone set apart, not by choice but by inevitability, till he pressed on. For a boy with sparks in his hands, retreat was never an option. The hum of his machine, the silence of his stone, the faint memory of a teacher's kind words, all these wove together into a soft but undeniable call. Forward. Adolescence ended not with celebration, but with quiet resolve. Rick emerged from those years not triumphant, but transformed. His eyes held more questions than answers. His heart carried more ache than ease. But his hands knew something they hadn't before: the thrill of creation, the power of sparks, the possibility of wonder. And so he stepped into young adulthood with a strange mixture of loneliness and fire. He wasn't ready for the world. But then again, the world wasn't ready for him. Young adulthood crept in quietly, without grand ceremonies or sudden revelations. One morning, Rick simply found himself older. His shoulders broader, his voice deeper, his hands steadier. What hadn't changed was the hum. It was still there, like a constant thread woven through his life. The hum of the stone, the hum of machines, the hum of restless questions echoing late into the night. But now there was something new beneath it all, a stirring of purpose. He no longer built merely for the joy of sparks. He built because he had begun to sense that these sparks pointed somewhere, like stars forming constellations that only he could see. His notebooks became more ambitious, filled with diagrams that bordered on the impossible. Sketches of machines too large for his small garage, ideas that teetered between genius and madness. He no longer asked himself if something could be done, but rather how soon. It was during this time that Rick first felt the weight of responsibility pressing against his curiosity. Creation was not without consequence. A failed experiment that once meant nothing more than frustration now carried risks. Wires could catch fire, gases could leak, metals could spark explosions. More than once neighbors complained about strange lights or acrid smoke drifting from his garage. And though Rick laughed it off, deep down he felt the truth. Wonder had teeth. It could bite if not treated with care, and yet he pressed forward. Because behind every risk was the glow of possibility, and Rick had always been drawn to the glow. It was also during these years that Rick began to see himself in the wider fabric of life. For so long he had existed at the edges, awkward, solitary, misunderstood. But as adulthood unfolded, he discovered that solitude did not have to mean emptiness. It could mean focus, discipline, even freedom. And within that freedom, he started noticing the subtle ways people moved through the world. The way his mother still paused to watch the stars before bed. The way his neighbor carried both weariness and kindness in his hands. The way strangers in cafes leaned close to whisper secrets. He realized quietly that invention was not the only kind of creation. Connection was too, and so he sought connection in small, unexpected ways. A conversation at a library with a girl who noticed the equations scribbled in his margins. A late-night talk with the retired engineer about dreams left unfinished. A shared sandwich with a fellow student who couldn't quite explain why she trusted him. These were not the grand friendships or romances he sometimes imagined in childhood. They were softer, smaller, but real. And in their realness, Rick felt something new take root: empathy. This empathy was not loud. It was not a sudden rush. It was more like a candle lit in the corner of a dark room, steady and patient. He began to understand that brilliance without compassion risked becoming cold. He began to see that kindness, though quiet, carried a power just as immense as sparks and circuits. There were failures, too, and they cut deeply. Times when he said the wrong thing or didn't say enough. Times when his inventions frightened rather than impressed. Times when he hurt without meaning to, simply because he did not yet know how to carry both genius and gentleness together. Those failures sat with him like stones in his pocket, weighty, unyielding, but they also became teachers. They reminded him that purpose was not only about what he could build, it was about who he was becoming while he built. The stone in his pocket, by now worn smooth, seemed to echo that lesson. He no longer believed it was magical in the way he once had, but he still kept it close, rubbing it between his fingers whenever the world felt too heavy. It reminded him of the boy who hummed lullabies to stars, the boy who found sparks in silence. And in that reminder, he found patience for himself. Rick's sense of purpose grew slowly, like dawn inching over a horizon. He began to ask himself different questions. Not only what can I create, but why am I creating? He didn't always have answers, but even the act of asking softened him. He noticed how his inventions could make life easier for those around him, even in small ways. A neighbor's broken clock that he fixed, a makeshift heater he built during a winter power outage, a light that stayed glowing long after candles burned out. These acts didn't change the world, but they changed moments. And sometimes moments were enough. His relationships, too, deepened in quiet ways. His mother, though often bewildered by his strange pursuits, began to trust that his path was his own. His neighbor, aging and slowing, leaned on Rick as much as Rick once leaned on him. And a new friendship formed, one with a fellow dreamer, someone who didn't always understand his machines but understood the heart behind them. They shared long walks, soft laughter, and a comfort in silence that surprised Rick. It wasn't romance, not yet, but it was a bond. And that bond taught him that companionship need not be loud to be profound. In those years, Rick also discovered something unsettling yet quietly liberating. He was not invincible. A failed experiment left him with a burn across his arm. A careless night of exhaustion ended in illness. A moment of grief, when a friend moved away, left him hollow for weeks. He realized in his bones that fragility was part of living. And instead of hardening against it, he let it in. Fragility became another teacher, one that whispered of limits, of tenderness, of care. The quiet hero's journey is rarely marked by banners or battles. It is marked by small awakenings, by noticing the way a star lingers in the sky longer than expected, by recognizing when silence speaks louder than words, by choosing kindness when frustration tempts cruelty. Rick's journey in young adulthood was just that, a series of small awakenings that stitched together into something larger than himself. There were still nights when he felt restless, staring at the ceiling, imagining machines that could pierce the sky or reshape reality. But now those nights were softened by the memory of connections, by the awareness that wonder was meant to be shared. He didn't always succeed in sharing it, but he tried. And the trying was enough. By the time Rick reached the close of his 20s, he carried with him not only the thrill of invention, but the weight of compassion. His hands could build, but now his heart could listen. His mind could stretch into impossible futures, but now his soul could anchor itself in quiet presence. Purpose had awakened, not fully, not perfectly, but enough to guide him forward. And though he did not yet know the shape of his legacy, he sensed that it would not be found in machines alone. It would be found in the way he carried himself in the world, with sparks in his fingers, with softness in his gaze, with a heart that, though scarred, remained open. For the boy who once whispered to a stone, this was no small thing. It was everything. If invention was the fire that lit Rick's nights, relationships were the embers that kept him warm when the fire dimmed. They were not dramatic or loud. They were not the kind of bonds sung about in epics or carved into stone. They were gentler, quieter, stitched into the fabric of his life with small, nearly invisible threads. But those threads held, and in holding they shaped him. The first was his mother. Their bond had always been complicated, as bonds often are between a boy with restless questions and a parent trying to hold on to normalcy. She did not understand his machines, nor did she always approve of the smoke and noise pouring from the garage. Yet she loved him with the kind of steady patience that endures even when comprehension falters. Rick noticed it most at night. Long after she believed him asleep, she would pause at his doorway, resting her hand against the frame. She would look in at the soft glow of his desk lamp, at the boy hunched over circuits and notebooks, and though she said nothing, Rick always felt her presence. It was not applause, it was not critique, it was simply love. And in that love, Rick found a foundation. The second bond was his neighbor, the retired engineer who had once slipped him the first broken radio. By now the man had grown slower, his hands a little shaky, his steps careful. But his eyes still carried sparks of recognition whenever Rick appeared at his door with a half-finished contraption or a question that refused to leave him alone. Their conversations had shifted over the years. Where once the neighbor offered instruction, now he offered reflection. He no longer solved Rick's problems for him. Instead, he asked questions that made Rick think harder. Why does it matter? He would say softly. What do you hope this machine will give you? At first, Rick found these questions frustrating, but in time he began to treasure them. They taught him that invention was not only about function. It was also about meaning. And then there was the third bond, one unexpected and tender, a friendship that felt almost like a secret. Her name was Emily. She wasn't a scientist or a tinkerer. She didn't carry notebooks filled with impossible equations. She worked at the library, cataloging dusty shelves, arranging worlds into neat alphabetical order. Rick met her when he returned to borrow a book he had already borrowed twice. She noticed the margin notes, the scrawled diagrams, the humming absent-mindedness that followed him even into quiet aisles. Instead of laughing or recoiling, she asked him about it, gently, as though she truly wanted to understand. Rick didn't know how to answer at first. Words failed him when it came to explaining why sparks mattered, why machines whispered to him, why the hum in his pocket still guided his nights. But Emily didn't seem to need explanations. She simply listened. Sometimes that was all. A presence across a library table, a nod that said she saw him, a small smile that carried no judgment. And slowly, Rick discovered that being understood was not always about detail. Sometimes it was about being held in silence, without needing to justify why you are the way you are. These three bonds, his mother, his neighbor, his friend, were like three lanterns placed along a winding path. Each lit a section of road that Rick might have otherwise stumbled through in darkness. They reminded him that genius could not stand alone forever. It needed warmth, it needed reflection, it needed companionship. But as with all bonds, there were fractures too. His mother, though patient, grew weary of his absences at the dinner table. His mind always half elsewhere. Sometimes her sighs cut deeper than words. His neighbor's health began to falter, and Rick realized with a pang that time was stealing from him the mentor who had shaped so much of his childhood curiosity. And Emily, gentle, steady Emily, sometimes vanished for days, lost in her own life, leaving Rick wondering whether he had imagined the connection at all. These cracks did not break the bonds, but they reminded Rick of fragility. They taught him that relationships were not permanent fixtures. They were living things requiring care, attention, and sometimes acceptance of loss. And so Rick tried, awkwardly, imperfectly, but sincerely, to care for them. He began joining his mother at the table more often, even if only for sandwiches eaten in silence. He helped his neighbor repair small things around the house, not because they were broken, but because the act itself brought comfort. He brought Emily coffee when she was tired, not because she asked, but because he noticed. In these gestures, Rick learned something invaluable, that love was not always about grand declarations. Often it was about noticing, about seeing the tiredness in someone's shoulders and offering rest, about remembering a detail someone mentioned once and bringing it back to them later, about choosing to remain present, even when the mind longed to wander. It was during these years, shaped by these bonds, that Rick's empathy deepened into something sturdier. He began to realize that his inventions, no matter how brilliant, would always matter less than the people they touched. A machine that sparked curiosity was beautiful, but a machine that eased someone's burden, that lightened their day, that gave them warmth, that was purpose. And yet, even as his bonds grew, Rick could not ignore the lingering hum of solitude that followed him. There were nights when, despite his mother's patience, his neighbor's wisdom, and Emily's quiet companionship, Rick still felt alone beneath the stars. It was not a loneliness born of neglect. It was simply the shape of who he was, a boy-turned-man whose heart reached into realms no one else could fully see. That loneliness hurt, yes, but it also propelled him. It reminded him that his journey, though shared in pieces, was his own to walk. In later years, when Rick looked back on this time, he would not remember the machines most vividly. He would remember these people, their hands, their voices, their small unspoken acts of love. He would remember the way his mother lingered at his doorway, the way his neighbor's eyes crinkled when asking impossible questions, the way Emily's smile softened even his stormiest days. These bonds became his anchor. They kept him from drifting too far into the vastness of his own genius, and perhaps more importantly, they became his teachers. From his mother, he learned the power of patience. From his neighbor, the wisdom of reflection. From Emily, the grace of being seen. Together, these lessons shaped not only the man he was becoming, but the legacy he would one day leave behind. For the quiet hero's journey is not built on battles won or empires conquered. It is built on moments of connection, on lanterns lit along the path. And in this chapter of his life, Rick discovered that the bonds we hold are not just parts of our story. They are the story. And so as the nights grew longer and the stars kept humming, Rick carried these bonds within him. They softened his sharp edges, steadied his restless hands, and reminded him that even the most brilliant spark is brighter when it glows beside another light. There comes a moment in every life when the world whispers a truth too soft to ignore. Nothing lasts forever. For Rick, that whisper arrived not as a thunderclap, but as a slow, inevitable unraveling. It was in the subtle tremor of his neighbor's hands, the quiet sighs of his mother after long days, and the flicker of absence when Emily drifted into her own world. Fragility was all around him, not in machines that broke, but in people he loved. And unlike machines, he could not mend them with wires or tools. Rick had always believed himself clever enough to repair anything. He could bend metal, coax sparks, and breathe life into broken circuits. But fragility of the heart, fragility of time, that was beyond him. It unsettled him, in a way equations never could. For how do you measure the length of a bond before it frays? How do you quantify the silence left when laughter fades? His neighbor was the first to teach him. The man who once filled Rick's nights with questions and wonder now moved slower, his words sometimes trailing into pauses he could not quite bridge. Rick noticed the fatigue in his steps, the way he reached for chairs as though the ground itself had grown uncertain. Rick tried to help, repairing loose floorboards, adjusting lights, inventing small gadgets meant to ease his days. But one evening, when Rick presented a device designed to keep the old man steady as he walked, his neighbor only smiled. "It's kind of you, Rick," he said softly, placing a weathered hand over Rick's own. "But some things aren't meant to be fixed. They're meant to be cherished while they last." The words settled heavily within him. Rick wanted to argue, wanted to believe that brilliance could outmatch time. Yet as he looked into those kind, tired eyes, he knew his neighbor was right. Fragility was not a flaw. It was part of the design. At home, his mother carried her own fragility, though she tried to hide it. The years wore on her shoulders, not dramatically, but in the small ways that mothers often endure. She bore the weight of bills, meals, and quiet evenings, waiting for a son whose mind was often elsewhere. Rick noticed her pauses more than her words. The way she lingered over family photographs, the way she sometimes held a cup of tea a little longer than necessary, as if its warmth could reach places no one else could. He wanted to thank her, to tell her how her patience had anchored him, but the words never seemed enough. So instead, he began to leave small notes on the kitchen counter, tiny scraps of paper with scribbled words like, "Thank you and I noticed." She never mentioned them, never asked where they came from, but Rick sometimes found those scraps folded neatly in her apron pocket. Fragility had taught him something here too, that love often exists in gestures too small to see, unless you're looking closely. And then, there was Emily. She was not fragile in body the way his neighbor was, nor in spirit the way his mother sometimes seemed. Her fragility was different. It was the fragility of distance. Days would pass where she slipped beyond his reach, lost in books, obligations, or perhaps thoughts she never voiced. Rick felt her absence like a silence in his chest, an echo where conversation used to live. He tried not to cling, tried not to ask for more than she could give. But still the ache was there. One evening in the library, sensing the heaviness in his eyes, Emily looked at him and said, "You don't always need to fix what feels fragile. Rick, sometimes you just need to sit beside it, to let it be." Her words mirrored his neighbor's in a way that startled him. Two voices from two corners of his life, telling him the same truth. Fragility was not something to defeat. It was something to accept, to honor. Rick carried these lessons into his nights. He began to notice fragility everywhere, not just in people, but in moments. The fleeting glow of sunset that lasted only a breath before fading into dusk. The way laughter filled a room and vanished just as quickly. Even his machines carried fragility, for no invention was ever permanent. Each spark eventually dimmed, each creation eventually wore down. And in seeing this, Rick felt something stir within him, a tenderness, an awareness that what makes things precious is not their endurance, but their impermanence. This realization did not come easily. At times it broke him. There were nights when he stared at the stars, furious that even they were not eternal, burning themselves out quietly while humanity watched. But there were other nights, gentler nights, when the same thought comforted him. If nothing lasted forever, then perhaps the pain he felt would not last forever either. Perhaps loneliness too was fragile. Perhaps even sorrow would one day fade. These thoughts brought Rick a strange peace. Fragility was no longer only a weight, it was also a gift. It reminded him to hold his bonds closer, to notice more deeply, to love without waiting for the perfect moment. For the perfect moment, he realized, was always now. Years later, when Rick would revisit these memories, it was not the brilliance of his inventions that lingered, nor the cleverness of his solutions. It was these fragile moments, his neighbor's hand resting over his mother's quiet sigh softened by a hidden smile, Emily's voice in the library, telling him it was enough to simply sit beside what was delicate. These memories lived on not because they were unbreakable, but because they were fragile, and in their fragility, irreplaceable. The quiet hero's journey often asks us not to conquer, but to endure. Not to master fragility, but to be softened by it. Rick was beginning to understand this. Each lesson drew him deeper into the kind of wisdom that cannot be written in equations or diagrams. Wisdom that hums like a lullaby in the heart, reminding us that to love at all is to risk breakage, but also to receive beauty beyond measure. As the stars shimmered overhead, Rick thought of all he could not hold forever. He thought of all he might one day lose. And instead of despair, he felt gratitude, for loss was only possible because something had mattered in the first place. Fragility was not the end of meaning. It was proof of it. And so, beneath the hush of midnight, Rick whispered a quiet vow, not to fight fragility, not to deny it, but to walk beside it. To honor each bond while it lasted, to hold each moment as though it were already slipping away. And in that vow, Rick's quiet journey deepened, carrying him further into the tender heart of what it means to be human. Farewells do not always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they slip in quietly, disguised as ordinary days, until you realize too late that a moment has already passed into memory. For Rick, the first farewell came on a winter morning, cold and slow, when his neighbor's chair sat empty by the window. The old man had been Rick's quiet compass for so long that it felt strange to imagine a world where he no longer lived next door. He had taught Rick to see stars as maps, to ask questions not for answers but for the wonder of asking. He had given him silence when words were unnecessary, and laughter when the air felt too heavy. And then, without announcement, he was gone, leaving behind only the imprint of his voice in Rick's memory, like the faint outline of footprints after snow has melted. Rick stood in the small living room of his neighbor's house, surrounded by shelves of worn books and fading photographs. The air still smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper, but the man himself was absent, as though the house had exhaled and emptied. Rick wanted to build something, anything that could bring him back. A machine to rewind time, a device to preserve voices, a spark that could reignite a life already extinguished. But he knew with a heaviness in his chest that some inventions were beyond even him. Instead, Rick sat down in the old chair, the one angled just so toward the garden. He closed his eyes and remembered evenings when they had sat together in this very spot, speaking softly about stars, about questions, about how fragile and beautiful it all was. And for the first time in his life, Rick realized that memory itself was a kind of invention, an imperfect device that preserved enough to keep love alive even if the person was gone. The farewell was not dramatic. There was no thunder, no sudden burst of wisdom. It was quiet, almost too quiet, like a lullaby fading into silence. Rick walked home afterward with snow crunching beneath his boots, carrying a weight that was both unbearable and sacred. He did not cry that night. Instead, he lay awake, listening to the hum of his machines, and whispered thank you into the dark. His mother noticed the shift in him. She saw the way he lingered at windows, the way he paused before speaking, as if measuring the weight of words. One evening, as she folded laundry by the fire, she said softly, "Grief has a way of making everything sharper, Rick. The air, the light, the sound of a door closing. It hurts, but it also means he mattered." Rick nodded, unable to answer. He had always feared endings, yet here was one he could not escape. His neighbor's absence carved a hollow inside him, but it was not empty. It was filled with echoes, lessons, laughter, and the quiet reassurance that love does not end just because a life does. Emily felt it too, though she expressed it differently. When Rick told her about the empty chair by the window, She squeezed his hand without speaking. They walked together through the library gardens later that week, and she paused by a tree where late blossoms clung stubbornly despite the cold. "See this?" she said, brushing snow from a branch. "It won't last much longer, but doesn't it feel even more precious because of that?" Rick looked at the fragile petals and thought of his neighbor's smile, the way it had lit up even the dullest evenings. He understood then what Emily meant. Fragility and farewell were not failures of life. They were the very things that gave it depth, yet knowing this did not erase the ache. That night, Rick would sometimes wake expecting to hear his neighbor's knock on the wall, only to be met with silence. He filled the emptiness with invention, sketching devices on scraps of paper, machines to record memories, tools to hold on to fleeting voices. None of them worked as he hoped, but he kept trying. Not because he believed he could erase loss, but because the act of trying felt like a way of honoring it. One evening, he sat with his mother at the kitchen table, blueprints scattered before him. She studied the mess of lines and notes, then reached out to touch his hand. "You don't need a machine to keep him with you," she said gently. "So he's already here." She tapped her son's chest with her fingertips right where his heart beat. Rick didn't answer, but he thought about her words long into the night. Maybe memory was less about precision and more about presence. Maybe the way his neighbor lived on was not in the exact sound of his voice or the precise tilt of his smile, but in the way Rick now looked at the stars, in the questions he continued to ask, in the quiet moments he treasured. The first farewell left Rick softer. It did not shatter him, though it could have. Instead, it reshaped him, carving spaces inside that made room for tenderness he had not known before. He found himself thanking people more often, lingering longer when someone laughed, noticing details he once overlooked. Grief, in its quiet way, had opened him to gratitude. It would not be the last farewell he faced. Life, he understood, was full of them, goodbyes large and small, each carrying its own ache. But this first one was important, for it taught him something essential, that letting go does not mean forgetting. That love once woven into you never truly leaves. On a still night weeks later, Rick returned to his neighbor's empty house. The new occupants had not yet moved in, and the rooms echoed with silence. He sat in the old chair once more, the garden now blanketed in snow, and whispered into the air, "I'll keep asking the questions. I'll keep watching the stars." And though no one answered, Rick felt a warmth settle over him, as though the universe itself had nodded in approval. He rose, stepped outside, and looked up at the night sky. The stars shimmered faintly, fragile and distant, yet steady. They reminded him of everything his neighbor had taught him, that life is not about permanence but presence, that farewells are not endings, but invitations to carry someone forward in memory. And with that, Rick walked home, lighter than before. The first farewell had hurt, but it had also given him a gift, the understanding that love, though fragile, is strong enough to outlast even silence. Love is rarely thunderous when it first appears. More often, it drifts in like fog over a quiet field, gentle, persistent, wrapping itself around you before you realize you're breathing it in. That was how Rick came to see Emily. Not as a sudden explosion, but as a steady presence, weaving her way into the small spaces of his life. They had always shared moments, laughter in the library, whispered secrets beneath the old oak tree, evenings tracing constellations with fingers instead of telescopes. But after the farewell to his neighbor, those moments deepened, as if grief had carved a space in Rick that Emily naturally stepped into. He noticed her more acutely now, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was thinking, the softness in her voice when she read aloud, the small pauses she took before answering a question, as though weighing truth against kindness. Emily was not extraordinary in the way stories usually describe love. She was not dazzling or impossibly radiant. She was human, fragile, imperfect. And it was precisely those qualities that drew Rick to her, for they reminded him that love was not about perfection, but presence. One evening they walked through the frost-bitten gardens behind the library. Emily carried a small lantern, its light flickering gently against the cold air. Rick, hands stuffed into his pockets, walked beside her, listening as she spoke about a book she had been reading. Her words spilled softly, half to him, half to herself, like lullabies disguised as sentences. "Do you ever think," she asked suddenly, "that love is just a promise we keep making? Even though we know how fragile we are? Rick looked at her, caught off guard by the weight of her question. The lantern cast shadows across her face, highlighting the seriousness in her eyes. He thought of his neighbor's empty chair, of the petals clinging stubbornly to the winter tree, of the ache that still lingered in his chest. And he understood, perhaps for the first time, that Emily was not asking for an answer. She was offering him a piece of her own vulnerability. "Yes," he whispered. "I think maybe that's what makes it matter." They didn't speak for a long while after that. Instead, they walked together, the silence between them not empty but full of unsaid promises, unspoken fears, and the quiet acknowledgement that love was always at risk of breaking. Emily became his anchor in ways neither of them spoke aloud. When Rick grew restless with inventions that failed to erase his grief, she was there, reminding him that trying itself was enough. When he grew quiet, lost in thought, she filled the silence with gentle stories. When he laughed, truly laughed, it was often because of her. And yet Rick feared the fragility of it all. He feared losing Emily the way he had lost his neighbor, feared the impermanence that seemed to haunt everything he touched. Love, he realized, was not only a comfort, it was also a risk. To love was to expose himself to the possibility of another farewell. One night, unable to sleep, Rick lay awake with these thoughts circling like restless birds. He thought of the stars, steady but distant, and wondered whether love could be like that, far away, untouchable, yet constant. Emily stirred beside him, half asleep, and murmured something he couldn't quite catch. The sound of her voice, soft and drowsy, calmed him more than any answer could. He closed his eyes, deciding that perhaps love was not about certainty, but about choosing to rest in the presence of another, even amid uncertainty. The days with Emily blurred into one another, marked not by grand events but by small rituals. They brewed tea together on rainy afternoons, sat shoulder to shoulder in the library, scribbled notes in the margins of books they shared. Sometimes they quarreled, brief, sharp disagreements over trivial things. But even their quarrels ended with quiet apologies, often followed by laughter, as though the fragility itself was a reminder to be gentle. Rick found himself inventing for her, though he never said so. A small music box that played lullabies he thought might ease her sleep. A lamp that glowed softly like moonlight, designed to keep her company when nights felt too long. These creations were not the ambitious, world-altering devices he once dreamed of. They were simple, tender gestures, born of the realization that love thrives in the details, not the grandeur. One evening, as they sat together beneath the stars, Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. Her voice was quiet when she spoke. "Do you think we'll last, Rick?" It was a question that might have frightened him once, but now he only looked up at the night sky, at the constellations they both knew so well. "I don't know," he admitted honestly, "but I know that tonight we do, and maybe that's enough." Emily smiled at his answer, and for a moment the fear that haunted him dissolved into something softer, acceptance. Love, he realized, was not about securing forever. It was about choosing to be present in the fragile now. As winter gave way to spring, Rick noticed the ways Emily shaped him. She softened the sharp edges of his cynicism, reminded him to linger in beauty, to laugh at small absurdities, to sit still without needing to invent or escape. Their bond was fragile, yes, but in that fragility lay its strength. It was alive, imperfect, vulnerable. It breathed. Rick carried this understanding with him even when they were apart. He would walk through town and see something, a wildflower, a child laughing, a fragment of music, and think of Emily. In those moments, he realized that love was not confined to the person themselves, but spilled into the world around him, tinting everything with quiet significance. Still, he knew nothing was permanent. The fragility of life had been etched into him too deeply to forget. And yet, instead of letting that truth harden him, Rick chose to let it soften him. Love was fragile. That was undeniable. But so were stars, so were blossoms, so were the very breaths they shared. Fragility did not make love weak. It made it luminous. On a warm spring night, sitting with Emily on the library steps, Rick finally understood the gift of their bond. It was not about lasting forever. It was about this: two people sharing stories, laughter, silence, and wonder, in a world that was fleeting but beautiful. Emily squeezed his hand and he squeezed back, both of them knowing without words that what they shared was fragile, and that was exactly why it mattered. Genius rarely feels like a blessing to the one who carries it. More often it feels like a restless tide, pulling, tugging, never allowing stillness. For Rick, his mind was both compass and cage, guiding him to discoveries, yet never letting him simply rest in the ordinary. From childhood, he had sensed it, this widening gulf between what he noticed and what others saw. Where a neighbor saw a lamp flickering, Rick saw currents of energy hidden beneath wires. Where a teacher described the simplicity of gravity, Rick questioned the fabric of space itself. It wasn't arrogance, at least not yet. It was simply the way his mind unfolded, relentlessly, ceaselessly, sometimes beautifully, sometimes unbearably. But genius, like fire, consumes as much as it illuminates. And in the quiet moments, after laughter with Emily, after evenings spent sketching ideas in his notebook, Rick would feel the weight of it pressing down. Why him? Why this endless stream of thought, of curiosity, of invention that could never truly be silenced? Emily would notice his distance at times. She'd reach across the table, touch his hand, and ask softly, "Where are you right now?" Rick would smile, but it was the tired kind of smile, the one that hides more than it reveals. "I'm here," he'd reply. But inside he was wandering, through equations, through half-formed theories, through possibilities that stretched far beyond their small town. His genius gave him wings, but wings, he realized, could be lonely things. He built late into the night. Machines that hummed with potential. Devices that whispered of futures untold. Most of them failed spectacularly, sparking or collapsing under their own ambition. Still, the act of creating gave him brief peace. Yet every success, every flicker of brilliance also widened the chasm between himself and others. Who could he truly share it with? Who could understand the restless storm inside him? Even Emily, tender as she was, sometimes seemed far away from that storm. She grounded him, yes, but she could not follow him into the labyrinth of his mind. And that truth ached like an unspoken wound. One spring afternoon, Rick sat in the library, sketches spread across the table. Equations lined the margins, diagrams sprawled in half-legible notes. A boy leaned over, curiously watching. "What is that?" the boy asked. Rick hesitated. "Just ideas. Looks like nonsense," the boy said before darting away, laughter trailing behind him. Rick sat still, the sting sharp despite his usual resilience. It wasn't cruelty that hurt. It was the reminder of his difference, the constant sense that his mind set him apart. And in that difference, he felt a shadow of isolation that no affection could fully erase. Emily arrived later, gathering the papers gently. "Don't let it get to you," she said, as though she had overheard the boy's words. "Not everyone will understand." "But I do," Rick wanted to believe her. He wanted to rest in the comfort of her reassurance. Yet a quiet voice inside whispered, "She doesn't, not really." She loved him, yes. She saw him, yes. But she could not walk the corridors of thought that stretched endlessly through his mind. He was alone there, and perhaps he always would be. That night, Rick sat on the roof of his home looking up at the sky. The stars blinked softly, indifferent and eternal. He wondered if genius was simply a kind of distance, an unbridgeable gap between himself and the world, between thought and belonging, and yet there was also wonder. For in those same restless thoughts lay beauty. He could imagine worlds where gravity bent differently, where colors sang, where time folded in on itself like paper. His burden was also his gift, and he could not abandon it no matter how much it cost him. Emily joined him quietly, carrying a blanket. She sat beside him, draping it over both their shoulders. "You think too much," she whispered with a smile. "Maybe," Rick admitted. "But if I stopped, I wouldn't be me." She leaned her head against him, and for a while they simply breathed together, their silence filled with unspoken understanding. In moments like that, Rick realized something important. Genius might be a burden, but it did not erase his humanity. He could still laugh. He could still love. He could still be comforted by the warmth of another's presence. His mind might set him apart, but his heart tethered him to the same fragile, fleeting world as everyone else. Still, the struggle remained. In the days that followed, Rick grew increasingly restless. He felt torn between two lives, the quiet, tender one with Emily, and the roaring, infinite possibilities within his mind. Could he hold both, or would one eventually consume the other? One evening he confessed to her. his voice trembling in a way she had never heard before. Sometimes I wish I could just be ordinary, just once, to wake up and not feel like my head is spinning with 1,000 things no one else can see. Emily looked at him, her eyes soft. Maybe ordinary isn't the answer. Maybe you just need to remember you don't have to carry it all alone. Her words lingered, soothing yet incomplete, for even as he leaned into her embrace, Rick knew the truth. Some burdens could not be shared. Genius was one of them, but perhaps, he thought as he closed his eyes, it didn't need to be shared to be softened. Perhaps it only needed to be witnessed, with kindness, with patience, with love. And Emily, in her quiet way, was already doing that. The stars above flickered like gentle promises. The night air was cool, steady, grounding. And Rick, though restless still, found a moment of peace in the fragile balance between brilliance and belonging. Sometimes, the right person arrives in life not with fanfare, but with silence. They don't rush in with answers or dazzling solutions. They simply appear like a candle lit in the dark, reminding you that shadows don't last forever. For Rick, that person was a man named Solon. Solon wasn't a scientist. He wasn't a mathematician or inventor. He worked in the library, of all places, his days spent among worn shelves and dust-soft pages. To most, he was just another quiet figure tucked into the corner of town life. But to Rick, who stumbled into the library one rainy afternoon, he became something far more. Rick had been restless that day, his mind buzzing with equations that refused to settle. He wandered through aisles, fingers grazing spines, searching for something he couldn't quite name. And there Solon sat, an older man with kind eyes and a voice that seemed to carry the calm of decades. "You look like someone searching for more than books," Solon said, without looking up from the volume in his hands. Rick paused, startled. "I guess I am." Solon closed the book gently as though not to wake it. "And what is it you think you're missing?" Rick hesitated, words caught between his lips. To say understanding felt too vague. To say peace felt too fragile. Finally he settled on a place to put it all. "My thoughts, my ideas, they don't stop." Solon nodded as if the confession was not strange but expected. "A mind like yours is a river. You cannot dam it, nor can you drink it all at once. The question is not how to stop the river, but how to walk beside it without drowning." Something in Rick stilled. No one had spoken to him like this before, not dismissing his storm, not glorifying it either, but simply naming it for what it was. From that day forward, Rick began visiting the library more often. Sometimes he read, sometimes he sketched, sometimes he simply sat across from Solon, the silence between them rich and comfortable. Solon never told Rick what to build or how to think. Instead, he offered gentle questions, like pebbles tossed into the river of Rick's mind, sending ripples outward. Does every idea need to be completed? What is the difference between creating to prove yourself and creating to understand? Who are you when the work is set aside? These were not questions Rick could answer easily, but they lodged themselves inside him, soft seeds that would grow over time. One evening, as rain pattered against the library windows, Rick asked the question that had haunted him for years. Why me? Why do I see things no one else does? Solon looked at him for a long while, his expression unreadable. Then, in a voice low and steady, he said, "Perhaps it isn't about why. Perhaps it's about how you choose to live with the gift, how you choose to let it touch the world." Rick frowned, unsatisfied yet unsettled in the best way. "But what if it's too much? What if it ruins me?" Solon smiled, the kind of smile that carried both sorrow and wisdom. "Then you must learn the art of resting in the middle of the storm. You must learn that your mind is vast, but it is not all of you. You are also hands that can hold, a heart that can love, a presence that can comfort. Do not forget the simple things, Rick. They matter more than any theory." Rick sat with those words long after the library closed. In the weeks that followed, something subtle shifted. He still built, still dreamed, still wrestled with equations late into the night. But he also began to notice smaller moments, the warmth of Emily's laughter, the way sunlight slanted through the window, the stillness of sitting beside Solon without needing to speak. It didn't erase his restlessness, but it gave it context. Genius was no longer a solitary storm. It was a river, as Solon had said. And a river could be walked beside, even admired, without always needing to be conquered. One afternoon, Rick showed Solon a sketch of a device he had been working on. It was ambitious, too ambitious, something that might never work. "What do you think?" Rick asked, half expecting dismissal. Solon studied the sketch carefully. "I think it's beautiful," he said. "Not because it will succeed, but because it shows your way of seeing the world. That in itself is valuable." Rick blinked. No one had ever told him his failures could be beautiful. No one had suggested that the attempt itself, the vision behind the work, carried its own kind of worth. That night, sitting on his roof again, Rick thought of Solon's words. For the first time in a long while, he felt not the burden of genius but the gentle possibility of it. Maybe he didn't need to solve everything. Maybe he didn't need to carry it all. Maybe it was enough to witness the stars, to wonder, to try and to rest. Emily joined him, as she often did, her head leaning against his shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Rick smiled softly. "That maybe not everything needs to be finished. Maybe some things just need to be seen." Emily's hand tightened around his. "I like that," she said. And for once, Rick believed she truly understood. The world was still heavy, his mind still restless, but something inside him had shifted. He was learning, not how to silence the river, but how to walk beside it. And in that learning, he found a fragile piece that would stay with him long after Solon's quiet lessons faded into memory. Love, when it first arrives, feels like a quiet miracle. It softens edges, slows storms, and gives even restless minds a place to land. For Rick, that place was Emily. Her laughter reminded him that the world was not only equations and galaxies, it was also warmth, touch, and belonging. But love has its own gravity, and when it collided with Rick's ever-expanding thirst for discovery, it became both anchor and weight. At first, the balance seemed effortless. Days with Emily felt like stolen sunlight, and nights with his inventions stretched long and fevered. He thought he could have both, intimacy and infinity, closeness and creation. But slowly the two currents began to pull in opposite directions. It started with small things, missed dinners, promises postponed, conversations where Rick's eyes wandered back toward half-drawn blueprints instead of Emily's face. She never scolded him, not really. Instead, her silence spoke louder, her pauses heavier, her gaze lingering a moment longer, as if waiting for him to return fully to her. One evening, as the stars scattered across the sky, Emily found Rick hunched over a workbench, tools spread like constellations across the table. "You've been here for hours," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm close, Em," Rick murmured without looking up. "Just a few more adjustments and I can test it." This could change everything." Emily hesitated, her hand still on him. "But what about us? What about tonight?" Rick froze for a fraction of a second. He wanted to say she was right, that he would set the tools aside, that nothing mattered more than her. But the pull of the unknown burned too brightly. "I'll be there soon," he whispered. Though they both knew soon was a fragile promise, Emily nodded, but her hand slipped away, leaving behind a coldness that lingered long after she left the room. Over time, these moments accumulated, small fractures forming between them. Rick noticed but could not stop himself. It was as if the universe itself leaned over his shoulder, whispering equations and possibilities he couldn't ignore. One night, he did manage to pull himself away, climbing up onto the roof where Emily sat wrapped in a blanket. She smiled faintly as he joined her, her eyes reflecting the moonlight. "Do you ever get tired of it?" she asked. "Of what?" "Chasing everything out there," she said, gesturing to the sky. "All the things you don't know. Doesn't it ever exhaust you?" Rick thought for a long moment. "Sometimes. But it's like breathing, Em. I can't stop. Even when I want to, the questions don't stop." Emily nodded slowly. "And where do I fit into that?" The question pierced him. He wanted to say she was the reason he kept going, the warmth that made the search worthwhile. And in some ways it was true. But another truth pressed in. Sometimes she felt like a tether holding him to a world too small for his mind. "You're here," he said softly, avoiding the weight of the question. "Always here," but Emily didn't look convinced. Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to find the part of him that still belonged fully to her. The more Rick chased discovery, the more he began to feel the quiet ache of distance. Love required presence, but discovery demanded absence. He couldn't be both, at least not entirely. And yet there were moments of reprieve. Like the evening when Emily handed him a small leather notebook. "For you," she said, smiling. Rick opened it to find blank pages waiting. "What's this?" "A place for the thoughts you can't finish," she said. "So you don't have to lose them, but you don't have to lose yourself either." Rick stared at the notebook, speechless. It was such a simple gift, but it carried Solon's echo. Not every idea needed to be completed. Sometimes it was enough to hold them gently without rushing. He kissed her then with more intention than he had in weeks. For a moment, love and discovery seemed to coexist, her gift a bridge between the two. But bridges can only hold so much weight. Weeks later, Rick became consumed by a new project, a design so intricate it stole sleep and time alike. Emily watched as he drifted farther, her own quiet growing louder. One night she finally said, "I don't want to compete with the stars, Rick. I just want to sit beside you while you look at them." Her words clung to him, heavy with truth. He didn't know how to answer. That night, as he lay awake beside her, he wondered if love was meant to root him when all he longed for was flight. He loved her, there was no question, but his love for discovery was different. Untamed, insatiable. In his dreams he saw her standing on the ground while he drifted upward into the sky, tethered yet pulled in opposite directions. He woke with a hollow ache, realizing the dream was less vision than reality. And yet even in the ache he could not stop. The river of ideas flowed, the stars beckoned, and Emily's presence both grounded him and reminded him of what he risked losing. In the quiet of dawn, Rick wrote in the notebook Emily had given him. The first page he filled with words, not equations. "I don't know how to love both the sky and the earth without losing one. But maybe that's what love is, the attempt, even if we fail." He closed the notebook and slipped it into his pocket. Emily stirred beside him, her breathing soft and steady. Rick kissed her forehead, whispering words she didn't hear. "I'm trying, Em, I really am." It was the truth. But whether it would be enough, neither of them knew. Fractures rarely arrive with a shattering sound. More often they begin quietly. Hairline cracks invisible to the eye, soft pauses in conversation, small hesitations where once there was ease. Rick and Emily had felt those tremors for weeks, perhaps months, though neither spoke of them aloud. Love, after all, makes us believe in the resilience of silence. The moment that would later feel like a turning point was in itself simple. A Thursday evening, the smell of rain still lingering outside. Emily had set the table with 2 plates, the food steaming softly between them. She waited, patient as always, though patience had begun to feel more like loneliness than virtue. Rick was downstairs in the garage, his hands blackened by grease and graphite, eyes alight with the glow of half-built circuitry. The project before him was unlike anything he had attempted before, a device not to travel through space, but to stretch time itself. The idea consumed him. He was certain if he could slow time, he could capture moments, hold them long enough to study, understand, and maybe even change them. The irony was lost on him in that moment, that in his attempt to stretch time, he was letting real moments slip away. When Rick finally stumbled upstairs, it was nearly midnight. The plates sat cold, the food untouched. Emily was curled on the couch, a blanket drawn around her shoulders, eyes fixed not on the television but on the silence between them. "You ate already?" Rick asked, though he could see she hadn't. "No," Emily said simply. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Sorry, I lost track. This thing I'm working on, it's big. Bigger than anything I've—" "Rick," she interrupted softly, her voice steady but heavy. "I don't need to hear about the project right now. I just needed you." The words cut sharper than she intended, and Rick felt them like a blow. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. Instead, he sat beside her, close but not close enough, and the silence stretched wider. That was the first fracture. Not a fight, not a broken promise, but the subtle realization that love alone was no longer enough to cover the widening space between them. In the days that followed, Rick tried in his own way to repair it. He brought her coffee in the mornings, sat with her during sunsets, asked about her day with more intention than before. Emily, kind as ever, responded with small smiles and nods, but Rick sensed the distance remained. She was there beside him, but not with him. One evening she finally spoke the words he had feared. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm just background for you, like the quiet hum while you're chasing something louder." Rick felt a pang deep in his chest. He wanted to argue, to tell her she was the very reason he did all of this. But the truth was harder. Sometimes, in the fever of invention, even love became peripheral. "I don't mean for it to feel that way," he said, voice rough. "You're not the background, Em, you're the anchor." Her eyes softened but didn't brighten. "Anchors hold ships steady, Rick, but sometimes they keep them from moving at all." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument could have been. Rick returned to his workshop, but the words echoed louder than the hum of his machines. He found himself staring at the device, wondering if slowing time could fix what was slipping away. But the truth whispered through him. Time wasn't the enemy. It was his choices within it. The fracture deepened weeks later. Emily asked him to join her for a family gathering, a simple dinner with her parents, an evening of warmth and ordinary conversation. Rick agreed, but when the night arrived, he never showed. Emily sat at the table, her parents asking polite questions, her smile brittle. She excused his absence with gentle lies. He was busy, he was working, he was tired. But inside, something cracked further. When she returned home, Rick was still in the garage, his face illuminated by the cold glow of machinery. "How was it?" he asked without looking up. Emily stood in the doorway, her arms crossed tightly against her chest. "It was fine," she said. Rick finally looked up, catching the edge in her tone. "I said I was sorry, Em. I got caught up." "This project, it's always the project," she snapped, her voice breaking. "Always the next discovery, the next idea, the next universe. And I'm just here waiting, always waiting." Her voice cracked on the last word, and Rick felt a rush of guilt unlike anything he had known. He stood, moving toward her, but she stepped back. The distance between them no longer just emotional. "I love you," he said. The words rough and desperate. "I know," Emily whispered, tears in her eyes. "But sometimes love isn't the problem. It's everything else." Rick reached for her, but she turned, walking away toward the bedroom. He stood in the doorway long after she was gone, the hum of the machines mocking him. That night, Rick opened the leather notebook she had given him. His hands shook as he wrote, "I can build a machine to hold time still, but I can't hold the moments that matter. I can invent 1,000 ways to travel worlds, but I can't stop losing the one beside me." He closed the book, pressing it to his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt the crushing weight of failure. Not as a scientist, but as a man. Emily was still there, still within reach. But the fracture had deepened, and Rick knew some cracks could never be fully repaired. The fear that haunted him was no longer about the vastness of the universe, but the fragility of the love he could not balance against it. As he drifted into restless sleep that night, one thought circled endlessly in his mind. Discovery could expand his world, but love was the only thing that made it feel like home. And he was losing it. The breaking point did not arrive with thunder. It was not a cataclysmic argument or a violent storm of words. It came instead like a whisper that lingers too long, a silence stretched so taut that the smallest touch makes it snap. For weeks, the distance between Rick and Emily had grown. Small absences became longer gaps, shared moments became rarer, and though the love between them had not vanished, it was buried beneath layers of distraction, disappointment, and quiet ache. Rick's experiments consumed him. He had grown obsessed with the machine he called the temporal lens. He believed it could freeze single instants in time, not to live in them, but to study them, preserve them like amber. To him it was the key to everything, understanding choices, preventing regrets, mastering the flow of existence. But to Emily, it was something else entirely. It was another wall between them. She watched him late into the nights, his eyes fixed on glowing circuits, his hands trembling with exhaustion, but refusing to stop. She admired his brilliance. She always had. But brilliance without balance had begun to feel like a void she could not cross. One evening she tried again. "Rick," she said softly, leaning against the doorway of his garage, "will you come upstairs? Just for a little while. We don't even have to talk, just sit with me." Rick didn't look up. His fingers danced across wires and dials. "I'm close, Em, closer than ever. If I can get this working, it'll change everything." Emily sighed, her voice tender but weary. "Rick, I don't need you to change everything. I just need you." Her words hung in the air, fragile and full. For a moment, Rick froze, the weight of them pressing against him. But then he shook his head, muttering, "I'll be up soon, just..." "Soon?" Emily stood there for another moment, then turned and walked away. This time she didn't pause in the hallway. She didn't wait in the living room. She went straight to bed, the ache in her chest sharper than before. Rick came up hours later, long after she had fallen asleep. He stood in the doorway, watching her breathe softly beneath the covers. For a fleeting moment, he imagined what life would be like if he could stay there, let the universe turn without him just to hold her hand in the dark. But the hum of invention called him back. He kissed her forehead lightly, whispered, "I love you, Em," and returned downstairs. The next morning, the bed was empty when he woke. Emily was gone. At first, Rick assumed she had simply gone to work early. But the hours stretched on and the house remained silent. By evening, he found a note folded neatly on the kitchen table. The handwriting was delicate, steady, and heartbreakingly calm. "Rick, I don't know how to compete with the universe. I don't even think I should try. I've loved you with everything I have, and maybe that love is still here, but it feels like I'm loving a shadow. I can't keep waiting for you to choose me when you've already chosen something bigger. I need to breathe, Rick. I need to find myself again. I hope you find what you're looking for, and I hope someday you realize it was here all along. Love, Emily." Rick's hands shook as he read the words. His chest tightened, and for the first time in years he felt utterly powerless. Not powerless against physics or enemies, or impossible odds, but powerless against the quiet departure of the one who had grounded him. He stumbled back into the garage, clutching the note like it was the last thread holding him together. The machine stared back at him, unfinished, its glow mocking him. He thought of smashing it, tearing it apart piece by piece. But instead, he collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. The garage was silent but for his ragged breathing. That night, Rick opened the leather notebook Emily had given him. His pen hovered over the page, then pressed down. "Emily's gone. Not because she stopped loving me, but because I couldn't stop chasing what was already here. I thought invention would save me. But invention is empty without someone to return to. I wanted to master time, and instead I lost it." Tears blurred the ink, the words smearing slightly. Rick let the pen drop, the weight of regret pressing against him like gravity. The days that followed were a haze. Rick drifted through the house like a ghost. He cooked breakfast once out of habit, only to stare at the empty chair across from him. He built a device to track locations across dimensions, not to explore but to check, irrationally, if Emily might still be there in another version of reality. But no machine could undo the fracture. No formula could rebuild what had quietly broken. Morty, still a child at the time, noticed the change. He watched his grandfather with wide eyes, sensing the sorrow even if he didn't understand it. He once asked, "Grandpa Rick, why do you look sad all the time now?" Rick forced a smile, ruffling Morty's hair. "Just thinking, buddy. Just thinking." But inside, he knew the truth. The breaking point wasn't just about losing Emily. It was about realizing that his hunger for knowledge and control had cost him the one thing that truly mattered in connection. Late one night, Rick stood outside staring at the stars. The vast sky stretched endlessly above him, beautiful and cruel. He whispered into the quiet as though Emily might somehow hear. "You were right. It was here all along." The stars, indifferent as ever, blinked faintly back. In the years to come, Rick would bury the pain beneath layers of cynicism, sarcasm, and endless invention. He would drink more, laugh louder, and hide the ache as best he could. But somewhere deep inside, the fracture remained. The breaking point had marked him, shaped him, carved something hollow into his core. And though fans watching Rick and Morty would laugh at his antics, would marvel at his intelligence and absurdity, some part of them always sensed it. The sadness that lived beneath the brilliance, the memory of a love lost, not through betrayal or tragedy, but through the quiet weight of neglect. That is why years later, certain episodes hit so hard. Because beneath the jokes and madness, there was always the echo of this breaking point. The moment Rick lost more than he ever admitted. The moment he chose the universe over the heart that loved him. And though the story was wrapped in sci-fi absurdity, the truth of it was painfully human. The years after Emily's departure did not rush by. They stretched, thin and brittle, like glass about to crack. Time moved, yes, but it moved without shape. Rick drifted through it as though carried on a current he had stopped trying to resist. The house was quieter now. Too quiet. Emily's soft touches, the folded blanket at the edge of the couch, the notes she sometimes left tucked into his lab coat, had all vanished. What remained was a space that felt both familiar and foreign. Rick still worked in the garage, still scribbled in his notebooks, but every project seemed less like discovery and more like distraction. At first, he told himself he would win her back. He would finish the temporal lens, prove its brilliance, show her that his obsessions had purpose. He envisioned knocking on her door, machine in hand, saying, "See, I did it for us." But weeks turned into months. Months stretched into years, and the empty seat at the kitchen table became less of a wound and more of a scar. Slowly, Rick stopped writing about Emily in his notebook. The entries became technical again, scrawled equations and fragmented theories. Yet the sorrow lingered, tucked into the margins, half-erased sentences, smudges where his hand had hesitated, and then came the drinking. It started small, a glass at night, something to soften the edge of loneliness. But alcohol, like invention, offered him an escape, a way to avoid staring too long at the quiet house, the empty garage, the truths he didn't want to face. Soon the glass became a bottle, and the bottle became a habit. He still created, of course. Inventions poured out of him, ray guns, portals, absurd gadgets that no one else could have imagined. But unlike before, the joy of discovery was gone. The work no longer carried wonder. It was merely a way to drown, a way to fill the silence before the next drink. People began to notice the change. Morty, growing older, sensed the heaviness that clung to his grandfather. The once playful experiments had turned into manic escapades. Rick dragged Morty into adventures across dimensions, not always out of necessity, but out of desperation. Chaos became his mask, and sarcasm his armor. At family dinners, Beth would sometimes glance at her father with both longing and frustration. She wanted to reach for him, to ask what weighed so heavily on his shoulders. But Rick's walls were high. Every joke, every sharp retort, every drunken laugh kept her at a distance. There were moments, though fleeting and fragile, when the mask slipped. Late at night, Morty once found Rick asleep at his desk, an empty flask on the floor. The leather notebook open beneath his hand. Morty glanced at the page and saw only 3 words written there, repeated again and again in a trembling scrawl. It was here. Morty didn't understand then. He was too young, too unsure of what the words meant. But years later, fans would piece together these fragments, realizing that beneath the chaos of Rick's genius was the hollow space left behind by Emily. And so the hollow years deepened. Rick became known not just for his brilliance, but for his recklessness. He pushed the limits of science, not because he sought knowledge, but because he sought distraction. He laughed louder, argued harder, and destroyed more freely. He was not chasing discovery anymore. He was running from memory. The hollow years were marked not by what Rick created, but by what he avoided. He avoided quiet rooms. He avoided stillness. He avoided anyone who might look too closely and see the ache he carried. Fans watching Rick and Morty decades later often pointed to these episodes as proof of his complexity. Beneath every absurd adventure, beneath every drunken rant, there was always a hint of something more, a shadow in his eyes, a hesitation in his voice, because even in the wildest chaos, the hollow years whispered through, there is one memory that stands out, one Morty would never forget. They had returned from a chaotic journey across a ruined dimension. Morty, exhausted and shaken, muttered, "Why do we keep doing this, Grandpa Rick? Why can't we just stop?" Rick stared at him for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then, in a rare moment of softness, he whispered, "Because if we stop, Morty, I have to remember." It was the closest he ever came to admitting the truth. The hollow years shaped Rick into the figure fans know today. Brilliant, cynical, sarcastic, and reckless. But what makes him resonate, what makes certain episodes still hit years later, is the knowledge that this cynicism was not born of arrogance alone. It was born of loss. It was born of grief. It was born of a man who once believed in love, who once believed in connection, and who now buried those beliefs beneath invention and alcohol. And yet, even in the hollow years, something tender remained. A flicker he could not extinguish. A soft echo of Emily's voice reminding him, it was here all along. Rick never said her name aloud again. But sometimes, late at night, With the stars spread endlessly above him, he would whisper into the void. Not for anyone to hear, not even for himself to believe, but simply because silence felt heavier than words. The hollow years were not heroic. They were not triumphant. They were the years when Rick stopped being the man Emily loved and became the man fans would later try to understand. They were years of noise to cover silence, years of laughter to hide sorrow, years of brilliance to disguise emptiness. And yet because of those years, the story still matters. Because every time Rick falters, every time his voice cracks or his mask slips, viewers are reminded that even the strongest walls are built around fragile hearts. That is why fans return. Not for the chaos alone, not for the absurdity or the science fiction spectacle. They return because beneath it all the hollow years remain, and in them the echo of a love lost and a man who never truly forgave himself. Morty never asked to be a student. He never wanted lessons carved from chaos, never wished for a mentor whose teachings arrived between hangovers and cosmic disasters. And yet Rick became his guide, not through structure or intention but through presence, through the strange pull of someone both broken and brilliant. In the early years, Morty clung to his grandfather with awe. Rick was larger than life, a man who built doorways between worlds, who spoke in equations that shimmered like riddles. Morty followed because it felt like stepping into wonder. But wonder has shadows, and shadows have weight. What Morty learned most wasn't how to handle gadgets or how to survive alien landscapes. It was how to carry contradictions. Rick embodied them. He was a man who could dismantle a galactic government, yet fail to remember his daughter's birthday. A man who could solve the universe's riddles, yet drink himself numb by nightfall. Morty absorbed these contradictions quietly, almost unconsciously. In the way Rick laughed too loudly when pain threatened to surface. In the way he kept moving forward, not because he sought meaning, but because standing still meant remembering. Fans often recall the episodes where Rick delivers cutting speeches about life's meaninglessness. Those words sting not because they are sharp, but because Morty and the audience see the grief behind them. Each cynical lesson carries the echo of loss, and in teaching Morty, Rick teaches himself over and over again that caring too deeply only leads to pain. And yet Morty did care. He cared fiercely. He cared even when Rick mocked him for it, even when compassion seemed like weakness. Morty noticed details, the way Rick's hands sometimes trembled before he poured another drink, the way his laughter caught in his throat at the mention of family. Morty's empathy grew in the spaces Rick left hollow. One evening, after a particularly exhausting adventure, Morty asked a question that lingered long after the credits rolled. Grandpa Rick. "Do you ever wish things could have been different?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He lit a cigarette, exhaled slowly and stared at the night sky. Then he muttered, "Different doesn't mean better, Morty. It just means—" Not this. Morty didn't know what to say. But in that silence, viewers caught something profound. Rick wasn't denying his pain. He was circling it, dodging it, wrapping it in smoke and sarcasm. And Morty, still young, absorbed that evasion as much as the lesson itself. The mentor's shadow is never only light. It is the shape cast when brilliance meets brokenness. And Morty walked within that shadow, learning how to navigate worlds both real and emotional. Over time, Morty began to change. He wasn't the same wide-eyed boy who first followed Rick into portals. He became cautious, more questioning, more aware of the costs hidden beneath Rick's genius. Fans noticed how Morty's voice grew steadier, how his choices carried weight. In some ways, he was becoming stronger. In others, more haunted. There is an episode fans often cite where Morty refuses to go along with Rick's reckless plan. His voice cracks as he says, "I can't keep pretending this doesn't hurt, Grandpa." That line, simple and trembling, feels like a mirror. It reflects not just Morty's growth, but the weight of Rick's influence. Because Rick, for all his genius, taught Morty more about pain than about joy. He showed him survival, but survival without healing. He offered knowledge, but knowledge without peace. And yet in those fragmented lessons, something remarkable happened. Morty began to see what Rick could not. He saw that caring, even when it hurt, was not weakness. It was strength. The mentor's shadow carried darkness, yes, but also clarity. By witnessing Rick's hollowness, Morty began to understand what he did not want to become. This is why the relationship resonates so deeply with fans. It is not simply a story of a mentor shaping a student. It is a story of a student quietly reshaping the mentor. There are moments when Morty's empathy cuts through Rick's armor. A soft hand on his shoulder, a quiet, "It's okay, Grandpa." A refusal to leave him behind even when Rick insists it would be easier. These gestures, small and human, ripple through the hollow years. They remind Rick, against his will, that connection still exists, and sometimes when Rick is too tired to fight it, he lets the reminders in. He lets himself believe for a fleeting second that maybe love is not only a liability. It is in these cracks that fans find the story's emotional weight. Because Rick and Morty is not only absurd sci-fi, it is also a quiet exploration of how love persists, even in the shadow of cynicism. It asks the question, what do we inherit from those who came before us? And how do we carry it without repeating their mistakes? Morty's journey, shaped under Rick's reluctant mentorship, becomes an answer. He inherits Rick's knowledge, but also his sorrow. He inherits cynicism, but also compassion. He learns not just through words, but through watching the man who tried so hard not to be a teacher. The irony, of course, is that Rick never set out to guide Morty. Yet in running from his past, he became a map of what to embrace and what to avoid. Morty's growth is inseparable from Rick's pain, and Rick's humanity, no matter how buried, is illuminated by Morty's care. That is why these chapters in the story still echo years later. Fans see themselves in Morty, trying to navigate the shadows of those they love, trying to honor wisdom without inheriting wounds. And they see themselves in Rick, haunted by mistakes, desperate to hide them, yet unable to prevent the truth from spilling into the next generation. The Mentor's Shadow is not a clean story. It is not a tale of wisdom passed down neatly. It is messy, contradictory, and deeply human. It is about how even the most broken people shape us, and how we in turn shape them. Late one night, after another impossible adventure, Morty whispered as Rick dozed in the driver's seat of the ship, "You don't have to carry it all alone, Grandpa. I'm here." Rick stirred but didn't respond. Maybe he hadn't heard. Maybe he pretended not to. But the faintest hint of a smile tugged at his lips as he drifted into sleep. And that moment, small and quiet, says more than any speech could. Because in the Mentor's shadow, love still lingers. Even when unspoken, even when buried beneath sarcasm and cynicism, it lingers softly, like a lullaby in the dark. Sometimes the moments that linger are not the loud ones, not the portals bursting open or the aliens screaming through the sky. They are smaller, quieter, almost hidden, like the weight of a blanket tucked over your shoulders when you didn't ask, or the faint hum of a lullaby that slips in when no one thinks you're listening. Rick was not a man of grand gestures. He wasn't the type to sit Morty down and say the words out loud, "I care about you." Words like that felt dangerous to him, too binding, too revealing. Instead, his affection slipped through the cracks of his defenses, disguised as throwaway choices. Fans remember one scene where Morty collapses after a brutal adventure, his body shaking with exhaustion. Rick doesn't say anything, doesn't offer comfort in a traditional way. But he adjusts the settings on the ship, dimming the lights, softening the hum of the engine, creating a space where Morty can finally rest. He mutters something sarcastic, sure, but his hand lingers on the controls, gentle, precise. That is Rick's love, hidden in shadows, whispered in half gestures. These moments often pass quickly on screen, but they stay with viewers long after. Because in them lies the truth we all long for, that even the most hardened hearts reveal themselves through care too small to dismiss. Morty noticed. Even when Rick dismissed his kindness with jokes or sighs, Morty felt the intention behind them. He began to realize that love did not always need to be declared loudly. Sometimes it lived in the tiniest exchanges, the way Rick stood a little closer when Morty looked nervous, the way he made sure Morty always had the last bite of a sandwich. In one memorable episode, Morty is shivering on a distant planet, the alien winds cutting through his clothes. Rick grumbles as if annoyed, but moments later tosses him a jacket that's far too big, muttering, "Don't say I never gave you anything." Morty pulls it tight, not missing the fact that it smells faintly of Rick's garage, oil, smoke, and faint traces of stardust. Fans remember that jacket not for its size but for its meaning. Rick, who pretended not to care, cared enough to notice Morty's shiver. Small kindnesses, when repeated, form a language of their own. Morty began to understand this language, how sarcasm was sometimes a shield, how muttered complaints often hid sacrifice. He recognized that Rick's constant readiness to fix a broken portal gun in the middle of the night wasn't just about science. It was about ensuring Morty could still explore, still dream, still survive. These gestures echoed louder because they stood against Rick's nature. A man who claimed life was meaningless, who drowned himself in cynicism, still found himself pausing to care. It is in this contradiction that fans see the truth. Love often survives despite despair. Viewers, too, carry these lessons. They think of their own lives, the mentors, parents, or friends who struggled to say the words but revealed them in the smallest actions: a ride home, a meal shared, a silence held. And in Rick's fumbling kindness, they find a mirror of those memories. Morty's growth bloomed in these spaces. He began to mirror the kindness he received, even if it came wrapped in roughness. When Rick stumbled, Morty offered a hand. When Rick pushed him away, Morty stood nearby anyway. Not out of naivety, but out of recognition. Love doesn't always look gentle. Sometimes it looks like persistence. One late-night scene captures this perfectly. Rick falls asleep at his workbench, head resting against cold metal, tools scattered across the floor. Morty, quiet, steps in. He picks up the tools, sets them aside, and gently places a blanket over Rick's shoulders. For once, Morty doesn't try to wake him, doesn't demand words. He simply offers the same small kindnesses Rick once offered him. That reversal, student becoming caretaker, is what makes the relationship unforgettable. It is what makes fans return year after year to these episodes. They see in Morty the truth that kindness is contagious, that even broken love still plants seeds. This is what makes the quiet hero's journey so different. There are no galaxies saved, no final victories. The journey happens in hushed rooms, in whispered acts, in the choice to stay when leaving would be easier. Morty's heroism is not in his battles, but in his patience, in his refusal to let Rick's despair define their bond. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rick begins to change. Not all at once, not permanently, but in glimmers. He lets himself rest when Morty is near. He lets himself laugh, not at the universe's absurdity, but at a shared joke only they understand. He even lets himself hope, briefly, in the safety Morty offers. Fans catch these glimmers and hold them close. Because they know how rare they are. They know how hard it is for people like Rick to let their guard down, even for a second. And when it happens, when the mask slips, it feels like witnessing something sacred. Small kindnesses are often invisible in the chaos of storytelling. Yet here they become the heartbeat of the narrative. They remind viewers that the most powerful transformations rarely arrive with fanfare. They arrive in whispers, in glances, in gestures so ordinary they are extraordinary. This is why the episode still resonates. Not because of the science, not because of the chaos, but because beneath all of it is the soft truth. Kindness matters, even when fractured, even when disguised, even when offered by those who don't know how to say it out loud. In the end, Morty learned that survival wasn't the only gift Rick could give. Rick gave him the fragments of care that made survival meaningful, and Morty, in turn, gave Rick a reason to keep offering them. One night, as stars drifted past the ship's glass, Morty whispered a thought meant more for himself than for Rick. Even small things, they make it easier to breathe. Rick, half asleep, muttered, "Don't get sappy on me, Morty." But his hand reached over, resting for a brief moment on Morty's arm, before falling away. It was clumsy. It was unspoken. There was love, and fans felt it as if it were their own. Loneliness is a soundless companion. It sits in the silence between conversations. It drifts in the corners of dimly lit rooms, and it follows even the brightest minds into their victories. For Rick, loneliness was not new. It had been stitched into his bones long before Morty ever followed him through a portal. Fans often notice it in the quiet transitions, the moments when the adventure is over, when the chaos has faded, and Rick sits alone at his workbench. The tools clatter, the bottles line the floor, and yet the stillness feels louder than any explosion. He has the company of genius, the hum of inventions, but genius does not fill the empty spaces at night. What makes this episode resonate so deeply is how it dares to hold on to that silence. Instead of rushing past it, it lingers. Rick, for all his arrogance, is framed not as untouchable, but as human. And in that humanity lies the ache of solitude, the kind many fans recognize in themselves. Morty, though young, begins to sense it. He sees the way Rick's shoulders slump when no one is watching, the way his laughter fades too quickly, leaving behind something hollow. Morty doesn't always understand the depth of it, but he feels it, like a draft seeping through a closed window. One evening in the episode, Rick stares out into the void of space. The stars reflect in his eyes, endless and unreachable. Morty asks him what he's looking at, and Rick mutters, "Nothing, Morty, just all the nothings out there." Fans remember the line not for its science, but for its sorrow. It's the kind of sentence that sticks, echoing long after the credits roll. Loneliness is not loud. It does not cry out for attention. It whispers. It gnaws quietly. Rick masks it with alcohol, sarcasm, and brilliance, but the mask slips in these in-between spaces, and viewers leaning into their screens late at night recognize the feeling. They know what it is to laugh too loudly in the day and sit too quietly in the night. Morty's presence becomes both a balm and a reminder. He softens the edges of Rick's isolation, yet his very presence highlights how much Rick fears losing connection again. Every small kindness Morty offers feels like light in the darkness, but Rick cannot fully trust it. His past has taught him that bonds break, families drift, and love is temporary. So he accepts the warmth, but with hesitation, as if expecting it to vanish. This contradiction, the genius who can cross galaxies but cannot escape himself, is what makes Rick unforgettable. He embodies a truth many people know but seldom admit. Loneliness can persist even in the midst of company. Even when surrounded by people, one can still feel profoundly alone. Fans return to this episode because it reflects that duality. The comedy and adventure distract for a moment, but beneath it is a mirror. Rick's loneliness resonates with theirs. And somehow sharing in that recognition feels like connection. In one subtle scene, Morty drifts to sleep in the corner of the garage. His breathing evens out, soft and steady. Rick pauses his work, looks over, and allows himself a long exhale. For a fleeting second, the loneliness retreats. Not because it is gone, but because Morty's presence softens it. Rick doesn't wake him, doesn't cover him with a blanket this time. He simply sits in the company of another heartbeat. For Rick, that is enough. The echo of loneliness is powerful because it does not resolve. It continues, pulsing beneath the humor, beneath the science. That is why fans feel it years later. It is not a problem solved, but a condition revealed. It is not a story arc that ends, but a truth that lingers. And it is in that lingering that the episode transforms. It becomes more than entertainment. It becomes a companion for those who too feel the quiet weight of solitude. The writers knew this. They allowed Rick's silences to mean as much as his monologues. They allowed his pauses to hold more weight than his outbursts. They trusted viewers to listen not only to what was said, but to what remained unspoken. This narrative rhythm mirrors the way loneliness works in real life. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is simply the absence of sound, the empty chair at the table, the fading of laughter when the room clears. And so when viewers see Rick pause, bottle in hand, eyes far away, they do not see a mad scientist. They see themselves, or someone they've known, or someone they've lost. Morty unknowingly becomes the bridge. His presence doesn't erase Rick's solitude, but it changes its shape. With Morty nearby, loneliness becomes bearable, softened by companionship. Without him, it sharpens into despair. This fragility of connection, the way one presence can alter everything, reminds fans of their own relationships. It makes them grateful for the people who sit quietly with them, who don't demand words but offer presence. The echo of loneliness, when woven into Rick's story, becomes more than a character trait. It becomes a reflection of the human condition. It whispers, no matter how far you travel, no matter how much you achieve, solitude will find you, and yet so will the chance for connection. That is the beauty of this episode. It holds both truths at once. It does not promise a cure for loneliness, but it offers a reminder. Even in the emptiest moments, one small connection can shift the silence into something softer. As the episode closes, Rick sits with Morty, the stars still sprawling endlessly outside. He says nothing profound, makes no confession. He just lets the silence stretch, but this time it feels different. The echo is still there, but it is no longer unbearable. It has been joined by another echo, the steady rhythm of Morty's breathing, the quiet affirmation of presence. And fans, watching in the stillness of their own late nights, feel that too. For a moment, they are not just watching Rick's loneliness, they are sharing it. And in sharing it, they feel less alone themselves. That is why the episode still hits hard. Because beneath the chaos, beneath the humor, it speaks to something we all carry. Loneliness is universal, but so is the hope that someone somewhere will sit beside us in it. Trust is never a grand declaration. It rarely arrives with ceremony or music. Instead, it grows quietly, often unnoticed, like moss creeping along old stone. For Rick and Morty, trust did not bloom overnight. It formed through stumbles, hesitations, and countless small moments. Moments that fans, watching carefully, still remember years later. In this episode, that fragile trust is at the heart of the story. Rick, ever the skeptic, shields himself behind sarcasm and logic. He scoffs at sentiment, pretends loyalty is a weakness, and yet in the spaces between his words, in the pauses he doesn't admit to, he reveals how deeply he wants to rely on Morty. Morty, on the other hand, embodies trust in its simplest form. He follows Rick into the unknown, even when he's afraid, even when he doesn't fully understand. Morty doesn't question every calculation, doesn't demand reassurance. His trust is imperfect, sometimes naive, but it is steady. And in that steadiness lies its strength. The episode makes this bond visible not through grand gestures, but through subtle ones. When Rick hesitates at a crucial decision, Morty doesn't press him. He simply waits. That pause, a quiet faith that Rick will do what needs to be done, becomes more powerful than any shouted reassurance. It is as though Morty is saying without words, "I believe in you," even when you don't believe in yourself. Fans who rewatch the episode often point to one small, easily overlooked scene. Rick drops a tool, his hands trembling slightly after a long, exhausting sequence. Morty picks it up without a word, places it back in Rick's palm and meets his eyes for a fleeting second. There is no speech, no dramatic music. Just a boy handing something back to his grandfather. Yet in that tiny exchange, trust is both tested and affirmed. Rick doesn't thank him, he rarely does, but he holds the tool tighter, steadier. For him, that moment is everything. The fragility of this bond lies in Rick's fear of betrayal. He has been abandoned before, hurt by those he once trusted. His intelligence shields him, but it also isolates him, convincing him that no one can truly stay. So when Morty proves again and again that he will not leave, it unsettles Rick almost as much as it comforts him. He does not know how to hold something so delicate without breaking it, and yet Morty's persistence is what allows the bond to survive. He doesn't demand Rick's openness. He simply offers presence. He listens even when Rick rambles, follows even when Rick stumbles, and forgives even when Rick falters. Fans see in this dynamic the fragile truth of all human trust. It is not built in declarations, but in the willingness to stay. The episode highlights this when Morty refuses to abandon Rick during a moment of danger. Rick urges him to go, shouting in frustration, but Morty shakes his head. His voice trembles, but he says, "I'm not leaving you, Grandpa." The words are simple, almost childish, but they carry the weight of a promise Rick struggles to accept. For a moment, his expression softens, only for him to cover it quickly with another joke. But the softness lingers, even as the scene moves on. Viewers connect deeply with this fragile balance. They know what it means to long for trust while fearing it, to push others away while hoping they'll stay. They recognize themselves in Rick's reluctance, in Morty's persistence, in the unspoken hope that loyalty might truly last. Trust in this story becomes less about survival and more about healing. Each time Morty stays, each time he believes in Rick, a small fracture within Rick mends, just slightly, never fully, but enough to matter. And each time Rick lets Morty close, Morty grows more confident, more certain of his place beside him. It is a dance of vulnerability, slow and halting but profoundly human. The writers knew that for trust to feel real, it had to remain delicate. They didn't force a dramatic breakthrough. Instead, they let it unfold in silences, in glances, in the weight of pauses. They trusted the audience to feel what wasn't said, and the audience responded. Years later, fans still describe this episode as one that felt strangely personal, as though it reached into their own experiences of loyalty and fear. One poignant scene shows Rick handing Morty a small device and telling him to hold on to it, just in case. His tone is casual, dismissive, but the gesture is not. For Rick to entrust anything, let alone something crucial, to another person is no small thing. Morty doesn't realize the significance in the moment, but fans do. They see Rick, for once, placing a piece of himself in someone else's hands. And that quiet act of trust reverberates throughout the episode. Trust is fragile precisely because it can be broken. The fear of loss makes it heavy, almost unbearable at times. But this fragility is also what makes it beautiful. The fact that Morty continues to place his trust in Rick, despite the risks, makes it more meaningful. The fact that Rick begins to trust Morty, even reluctantly, makes it extraordinary. By the end of the episode, nothing overtly changes. Rick is still Rick, sarcastic, guarded, brilliant, broken. Morty is still Morty, earnest, loyal, often afraid, but always steadfast. Yet the audience feels the shift. The bond has deepened, not through grand gestures, but through fragile, repeated acts of trust. That is why this episode endures. It captures the delicate truth that trust is both terrifying and necessary. It shows that trust doesn't erase fear, but exists alongside it. And it reminds viewers that trust, once given, even imperfectly, can change everything. As the credits roll, fans carry this lesson with them. They think of their own fragile bonds, the people who stood beside them in silence, the ones who placed faith in them when they didn't deserve it. And they remember that trust, though delicate, is worth holding on to, because sometimes the smallest promise, the quietest loyalty, can be enough to keep the echo of loneliness at bay. Memory is a strange companion. It clings to us, even when we wish it wouldn't. It shapes who we are, even when we try to escape it. For Rick, memory is both a weapon and a wound. It sharpens his brilliance, fuels his drive, but it also drags him into places he cannot leave behind. And in this episode, memory is everywhere, present not in words but in the shadows between them. From the opening moments, there's a sense that Rick is carrying more than what the plot reveals. His eyes linger too long on empty spaces. His muttered jokes are a little too sharp, as if meant to deflect something heavier. Morty, of course, doesn't always notice, but the audience does. They see the subtle way Rick carries ghosts, memories that refuse to let him go. This episode resonates with fans because it reminds them of how memory works in their own lives. Not as neat stories tied up with clarity, but as fragments, images, sounds, moments that arrive uninvited. A laugh from someone who's gone. The echo of an argument never resolved. A promise broken, a chance missed. Memory, like Rick, hides behind humor, but it is never truly silent. At one point in the episode, Rick pauses in his workbench tinkering. Morty asks him a simple question, something about why he chose a particular tool, and Rick doesn't answer. Instead, he stares at the object for a long moment, as if it reminds him of someone or something he can't bring himself to explain. Then he shrugs, mutters a joke, and moves on. But that silence carries more weight than the joke ever could. Fans remember this because it feels so real. How many times have they too fallen quiet at a memory? How many times have they brushed it off with humor because speaking the truth felt too heavy? In Rick's silence, they recognize their own. The episode doesn't need to spell out Rick's past to make it felt. Instead, it allows memory to live in gestures, in expressions, in the way he looks at Morty, as though he is both seeing him and someone else who came before. That duality, loving the present while haunted by the past, is what gives the episode its lasting emotional depth. For Morty, memory works differently. He doesn't carry the same weight Rick does, at least not yet, but he notices the heaviness in his grandfather, even if he doesn't fully understand it. There's a moment where Morty tells Rick, "You look tired." The words are simple, almost innocent, but they cut to the truth. Rick isn't just tired in body, he is tired in memory. He is tired from carrying the weight of what he cannot forget. This bond between them deepens in quiet exchanges. Morty doesn't pry. He doesn't demand Rick unburden himself. Instead, he offers presence. And in that presence, Rick finds a kind of release. He may never fully share the details of his past, but simply having Morty nearby makes the weight of memory slightly less crushing. The writers of this episode understood something profound. Memory is not always about what is revealed. Sometimes it is about what remains unspoken. Fans feel the heaviness precisely because the show doesn't explain it. The lack of detail leaves space for viewers to fill with their own memories, their own ghosts. In this way, the episode becomes deeply personal. There's one particular scene that lingers with fans long after. Rick, half distracted, begins humming a tune while working. It is a lullaby, soft, almost broken. Morty notices, tilts his head and asks, "What's that song?" Rick immediately stops, brushes it off, muttering that it's nothing. But the look in his eyes says otherwise. That fragment of melody is a memory he cannot bring himself to revisit aloud. Fans watching catch that flicker and feel its sting, because everyone knows a song that carries memory. Everyone has a sound, a smell, a phrase that brings back what they wish they could forget. The weight of memory is not always tragic, though. There is beauty in it, too. For Rick, the moments he remembers are not only losses but also joys. Times when he once felt whole, once felt connected. Those memories are painful because they are precious. And in Morty, Rick sometimes glimpses echoes of that lost warmth. He won't say it, but his eyes give him away. This is why fans still talk about the episode years later. It doesn't just tell a story. It asks a question. What do we carry and how does it shape us? Viewers see Rick's memories bleeding into his choices, his fears, his guardedness, and they reflect on their own. They think of the people they've lost, the chances they didn't take, the laughter that now exists only as memory. This is why fans still talk about the episode years later. It doesn't just tell a story. It asks a question. What do we carry and how does it shape us? Viewers see Rick's memories bleeding into his choices, his fears, his guardedness, and they reflect on their own. They think of the people they've lost, the chances they didn't take, the laughter that now exists only as memory. The episode never resolves Rick's memories. It doesn't need to. Life rarely does. Instead, it shows how memory lives alongside us, shaping but not defining. It shows that even in the presence of heavy memory, new bonds can grow, new trust can form. Rick may never outrun his past, but he can still walk forward with Morty beside him. And that is enough. Toward the end of the episode, there is a quiet moment where Rick looks at Morty, not with sarcasm, not with frustration, but with something softer. It lasts only a second, easily missed, but fans hold on to it. Because in that second, Rick is not just a man of science or cynicism. He is a man of memory, choosing, however briefly, to let love slip through the cracks of his defenses. As the credits approach, viewers are left not with answers, but with resonance. They feel the weight of Rick's past and are reminded of their own. They see how memory hurts, but also how it binds us to the people we love. And they realize that even the heaviest memories can be softened, not erased, by presence, by loyalty, by love that remains. That is why this episode endures, because memory endures, and because in Rick's haunted eyes, fans see a reflection of their own. There are moments in stories that do not need volume to be heard. They do not need explosions, revelations, or grand gestures. Sometimes the most unforgettable moments are whispers, the fragile, fleeting seconds when a character allows themselves to be seen. In this episode of Rick and Morty, what fans carry with them years later is not only the science fiction chaos, but the trembling echo of vulnerability in Rick himself. For much of his life, Rick is a fortress. He is sarcasm, bravado, and intellect wrapped into a wall that few ever breach. His humor is sharp, his words are quick, and his mind is always moving faster than the people around him. But walls, no matter how well built, have cracks. And in this episode, one of those cracks glows faintly through the armor. It does not come in a speech. It does not come in confession. It comes instead in a look, a pause, a hesitation so subtle you could almost miss it. Fans who notice it, though, are struck by its quiet power. For the first time, Rick seems less like the man who has everything figured out, and more like someone who carries pain, who longs for connection, even if he doesn't know how to ask for it. The vulnerability of Rick in this episode is important not just for his character, but for the audience. Fans are used to seeing him invincible in his wit, untouchable in his science. To see that crack, however brief, is to be reminded that brilliance does not erase loneliness. It is to see that even the strongest minds ache for gentleness. That reminder lingers long after the episode ends. There is a scene where Morty says something surprisingly tender, not planned, not profound, just a simple kindness spoken without thought. The words themselves aren't extraordinary, but Rick's reaction is. Instead of deflecting, instead of immediately making a joke, he hesitates. His eyes flicker, and he almost seems to allow the warmth to touch him. For a second, his walls lower. Fans catch that and hold it close. It is not a grand display, but it is honest, and honesty is rare for Rick. The writers knew the strength of subtlety here. To have Rick pour his heart out would have broken the believability of his character. Instead, the show lets him falter in small ways. A softened expression. A silence where there would usually be a quip. A sudden change of subject that feels less like avoidance and more like retreat. Vulnerability in Rick's language is measured in hesitation. For fans, these moments are what make the episode hit so hard. They remind us that vulnerability rarely arrives with fanfare in our own lives. Most often, it is a pause before answering, a sigh that slips through, a look that lingers too long. We recognize ourselves in those hesitations because we too guard our hearts. We too let the cracks show only for those who are close enough to notice. There's another layer to this vulnerability, though the way it shapes Morty. For Morty to see Rick not as untouchable but as fragile, even briefly, is transformative. It deepens his empathy, his patience. It makes him realize that his grandfather is not just a guide, but a man who sometimes needs guiding too. Fans cherish this shift because it reflects a truth of real relationships. Strength and care are never one-directional. Even the ones who lead us sometimes need us to hold them steady. One of the most poignant sequences comes near the episode's end, where the tone grows hushed. Rick is alone, or seems to be. He pours himself a drink, but this time it doesn't feel like celebration or indulgence. It feels like ritual, a quiet attempt to silence something inside him. The animation lingers on his face, not in caricature but in subtle detail. His eyes are tired, not from lack of sleep but from the weight of always pretending. For a heartbeat, viewers glimpse him without the mask. Vulnerability in its purest form, unguarded solitude. Fans still talk about this moment because it feels achingly real. How often have they too sat alone with their thoughts, performing small rituals to quiet the noise of memory or doubt? The scene resonates because it is not just Rick's story. It is everyone's story told through him. What gives this vulnerability its power is that it is fleeting. Rick doesn't collapse into Morty's arms, nor does he deliver a monologue about pain. The episode respects his character enough to let him remain complex. Vulnerability is not a permanent change, but a glimpse. And yet glimpses are often what we remember most. The echo of vulnerability extends beyond the screen. It lingers with fans, encouraging them to reflect on their own hesitations, their own walls. It makes them consider the people in their lives who may mask their pain with humor, intellect, or bravado. Watching Rick, they are reminded to look closer at the ones they love, to notice the pauses, the silences, the cracks that reveal where care is most needed. The music in this episode underscores the theme beautifully. Soft notes rise in moments of quiet, fading almost before you notice them. They don't intrude but cradle the vulnerability, amplifying it without overwhelming. It feels almost like a lullaby, gentle, haunting, unfinished. Fans often recall the way the score seemed to hold Rick in those moments, as though the show itself was offering him comfort when he couldn't ask for it. By the time the episode closes, vulnerability has not solved Rick's problems, nor has it rewritten his character, but it has revealed something essential, that beneath all the layers of wit and brilliance, there is a human being who longs, who aches, who wishes for connection. And that perhaps is the truest form of strength, not invincibility, but the courage to be seen, however briefly, in weakness. Years later, fans still return to this episode because of that echo. They may forget some of the jokes, the gadgets, even the details of the plot, but they remember how it felt to watch Rick hesitate. They remember the way his silence spoke louder than words. They remember because vulnerability is unforgettable. For Rick, those cracks will never fully close, no matter how hard he tries. And for fans, they don't want them to, because in those cracks they see themselves. They see the humanity of a character who otherwise feels larger than life. And that humanity is what makes this episode endure in the quiet corners of their memory. There are truths we speak, and there are truths we carry quietly, folded in the spaces between words. The most enduring relationships in life are not the ones shouted aloud, but the ones built on glances, silences, and unspoken care. In this episode of Rick and Morty, fans find themselves struck by how much is said without being said, How much is revealed not in dialogue, but in the stillness between it. Rick and Morty's relationship is the heart of this episode. For all the interdimensional chaos and bizarre encounters, what lingers most is the growing sense that they need each other in ways neither dares to name. Rick, with his walls of intellect and cynicism, would never confess openly. Morty, with his nervousness and yearning for approval, wouldn't know how. But their actions, their pauses, their shared glances, they speak a language more profound than words. Early in the episode, there is a small moment many might miss on first viewing. Morty, overwhelmed by the absurdity of the situation, looks to Rick not for answers, but for reassurance. Rick doesn't respond with one of his usual dismissive remarks. Instead, he places a hand briefly on Morty's shoulder. The gesture lasts less than a second, but it anchors Morty. Fans still recall this touch as one of the quietest yet most powerful signs of their connection. In the stillness of that moment, an entire story of trust is told. Morty's devotion to Rick is different from simple loyalty. It is not blind, nor is it naive. Over the course of the series, Morty has seen Rick's flaws as clearly as anyone. His selfishness, his cruelty, his recklessness. And yet, in this episode, Morty shows something deeper. He chooses to stay, not because he is fooled by Rick's genius, but because he sees something worth saving in him. The love Morty feels is complicated, but it is steady, and fans feel the weight of that steadiness. Rick's side of the bond is quieter still. He rarely, if ever, articulates his affection for Morty, but in this episode, the way he protects him feels less like reflex and more like intention. He shields Morty, not because he needs him for an experiment or a scheme, but because some part of him cannot bear the thought of losing him. That realization unfolds not in words, but in the gentleness of Rick's gaze when Morty isn't looking. Fans who catch it find themselves unexpectedly moved, as if they've stumbled into a secret. This unspoken language resonates because it mirrors real life. We often fail to tell the people closest to us how much they mean. Instead, we let our love seep through in the smallest gestures, driving them home when they're tired, saving the last piece of food for them, standing beside them when words would only get in the way. Rick and Morty's bond, especially in this episode, reminds us that love need not be perfect to be profound. There is a tender sequence halfway through the story where Morty, exhausted, begins to nod off. Rick could wake him, could push him to keep going, but instead he lets him sleep. He keeps watch, silent, shoulders slumped but eyes alert. The camera lingers on Rick in that moment, showing the unspoken vow, "I'll carry this weight for you even if I never say it out loud." Fans still speak of that scene because it is one of the rare times Rick's care is shown in action. Not hidden behind sarcasm, equally important is how Morty, in turn, cares for Rick. Near the episode's end, when Rick falters, Morty steps closer, steadying him, not with words but with presence. He doesn't scold or lecture. He doesn't even fully understand the weight Rick carries, but he offers himself anyway, simply by being there. That gesture, unadorned and simple, resonates with viewers who know what it feels like to care for someone who cannot ask for help. Fans often describe these scenes as comforting because they remind them of relationships in their own lives where words are inadequate. A parent sitting quietly with their child after a hard day. A friend staying on the line without speaking, just so you don't feel alone. A partner's hand slipping into yours when you need it most. The bonds that sustain us are not made of declarations but of presence. The writers wove this theme masterfully into the episode. Rather than grand confrontations or emotional speeches, they trusted the silence. They trusted the audience to understand that a look, a touch, or a pause could carry more weight than dialogue. That trust paid off, as fans to this day cite this episode as one of the most emotionally resonant in the series, not because of what was said, but because of what was left unsaid. The unspoken bond between Rick and Morty is also layered with fragility. Fans know that Rick often sabotages himself, that he pushes people away. This makes the quiet moments of care even more precious. They feel rare, almost accidental, like sunlight breaking briefly through heavy clouds. That rarity is what makes them unforgettable. In one of the most poignant shots, the two sit side by side in silence. There is no music, no dialogue, just the faint hum of the environment around them. Rick's posture is weary, Morty's uncertain. Yet their closeness speaks louder than any exchange could. Fans describe this scene as one that lulls them into reflection, as if they too are sitting beside someone they love, sharing a silence that needs no filling. These bonds matter because they remind us of our own humanity. Fans do not just see Rick and Morty, they see themselves, their families, their friendships reflected back at them. They remember the times they failed to say, "I love you," but showed it anyway. They remember the comfort of someone simply staying close when words were impossible. And in remembering, they feel both the ache of nostalgia and the peace of recognition. By the close of the episode, no grand revelations are spoken, yet fans walk away knowing more about Rick and Morty's relationship than ever before. Their bond is not fragile despite its silence. It is strong because of it. And that strength continues to ripple outward, reminding viewers that the truest connections are not those proclaimed, but those lived quietly in everyday moments. Years later, fans still return to this episode, not only for its humor or science fiction, but for its tenderness. They watch Rick's hand hover near Morty's shoulder. They watch Morty steady Rick without words. They watch two characters who could so easily be defined by chaos instead defined by care. And in doing so, they are reminded of the bonds in their own lives, the ones that exist not in words, but in the spaces between them. Because sometimes, the loudest love is the one that never needs to be spoken. Memory has a way of softening the sharp edges of time. What once felt chaotic, even overwhelming, begins to glow differently when seen through the lens of recollection. The episode at the heart of our journey is remembered not for its wild science fiction twists, but for the way it lingers in memory, like a lullaby half forgotten, yet still capable of stirring the heart when hummed softly in the dark. For many fans, this episode is not just something they watched once and moved on from. It became a memory layered with their own lives. People remember where they were when they first saw it, some curled up in college dorm rooms, others lying on couches late at night, headphones in, the rest of the house asleep. They remember how it made them feel, an ache, a tenderness, a strange quiet sense of belonging. The episode, in this way, wove itself into their own personal histories. Memory is not a perfect archivist. It does not keep every detail intact. Instead, it chooses. It selects the scenes and feelings that matter most. From this episode, fans often recall not the elaborate alien trickery, not the scientific jargon, but the small human moments. Rick watching Morty sleep. Morty steadying Rick when he faltered. The quiet between them that spoke louder than any explosion or revelation. These memories are stitched into the hearts of viewers, becoming part of their own inner story. There is a power in shared memory as well. Years after the episode aired, fans still gather to talk about it online. In forums, in comment sections, in late-night conversations with friends, they recall together, reinforcing one another's emotions. "Do you remember the way Rick looked at him?" Someone writes. "Yes, I thought I imagined it," another replies. "That moment broke me." The episode lives not just in individual memory, but in a collective one, a community of feeling that refuses to fade. Memory in this sense becomes a kind of legacy. The creators of the show may have written and animated the story, but once it was released, it no longer belonged only to them. It belonged to the fans who carried it forward, revisiting it, retelling it, reshaping it through their own lenses. In that way, the episode grew into something larger than itself, a symbol of vulnerability in a show often defined by cynicism. Rick's character, especially, is remembered differently because of this episode. Fans often describe him as harsh, reckless, selfish. Yet here, they remember the glimmers of tenderness, the fleeting moments where his guard fell. These memories complicate his legacy. He is not just a broken man hiding behind genius, he is also a man capable of quiet love, though he rarely shows it. That complexity is what keeps fans returning, because it mirrors the complexity of people they know in their own lives. Morty, too, carries a legacy through this memory. He is not only the bumbling sidekick, the nervous boy swept along in Rick's chaos. In this episode, he is a mirror of patience and devotion. He remembers to care for Rick when Rick cannot care for himself. Fans carry this memory as proof that Morty is more than comic relief. He is the steady heart at the center of their adventures. The legacy of memory is not static. As fans grow older, the way they recall the episode changes. Some who watched it in their youth now revisit it as adults, seeing things they didn't before. What once felt like a quirky moment now feels like a mirror of their own experiences with family, with aging, with loss. The episode grows with them, deepening in meaning because memory is not frozen, it evolves. There is a quiet magic in this transformation. An episode that once entertained becomes, years later, a source of reflection. Viewers find themselves remembering their own loved ones, their own unspoken bonds. They recall nights sitting silently with a parent, a friend, a partner, and feeling the comfort of presence without words. The memory of Rick and Morty's bond calls forth their own memories, creating a bridge between fiction and life. In this way, the legacy of memory becomes a cycle. The show gives its viewers a story. The viewers carry it, and in carrying it, they attach their own lives to it. When they speak of it, they are not only speaking of the show, they are speaking of themselves. And so the episode becomes immortal, not because it was perfect, but because it lives on in hearts that refuse to let it go. Some fans describe rewatching the episode like returning to an old photograph. The details may have faded, but the emotion rushes back all the same. They find themselves mouthing lines they had forgotten they knew, anticipating gestures before they happen, smiling or tearing up at the same moments as before. In these rewatchings, memory refreshes itself, keeping the legacy alive. Even the imperfections of memory play a role. Fans sometimes misremember details. Was it this line or that one, this look or another? Yet even in misremembering, the truth of the bond remains. What mattered was not the precise wording, but the feeling it gave them. That feeling does not fade. In fact, it often grows stronger. Like a story retold so many times, it becomes more legend than fact. This is the legacy Rick leaves through the episode. Not answers, not solutions, but feelings carried forward. The episode does not resolve him, does not transform him overnight, but it leaves a memory of tenderness, of possibility, of love hidden beneath cynicism. And for fans, that memory becomes part of how they understand not only Rick but themselves. Morty's legacy, too, is preserved in memory. Fans recall his steadiness, his devotion, his willingness to care for someone who cannot admit they need care. They carry this memory into their own lives, finding inspiration to be patient with difficult people, to love without needing acknowledgement. In this way, Morty's role extends beyond the screen into the quiet decisions fans make in their everyday lives. Years later, when fans are asked why this episode still hits so hard, their answers circle back to memory. It made me feel something I couldn't explain. It reminded me of my grandfather. It was the first time I saw Rick as more than a caricature. These are not surface-level comments. They are memories spoken aloud, testaments to the lasting power of a single story. The legacy of memory is simple yet profound. It is not about the brilliance of the science fiction twist or the cleverness of the dialogue. It is about the way a story once told becomes part of the listener, the way it tucks itself into their heart and waits quietly, resurfacing years later when least expected. This episode for so many fans became exactly that, a memory that softened, deepened, and endured, and perhaps that is why it still matters. Not because it solved anything, but because it gave people something to carry, a memory of unspoken love, a memory of tenderness hidden in chaos, a memory of two people, broken and imperfect, caring for each other in silence. That memory is the legacy, because stories fade from screens but not from hearts. And when a memory lingers, it becomes more than entertainment. It becomes part of who we are. There comes a moment in every story when the words no longer press forward with urgency, but instead soften, like waves that have reached the shore and linger only as foam. That is where we find ourselves now, in the gentle place between remembrance and release. This episode, this story we have held so closely, does not ask us to cling forever. It asks us to carry what matters and to let go with love. For many fans, the first time they watched the episode was not the last. They returned again and again to revisit its quiet power. Yet each rewatch also brought with it the realization that part of the beauty was in the act of letting go. The episode itself did not demand closure. It left things open, unresolved, in ways that mirrored life itself. Rick did not suddenly become a new man. Morty did not transform into a hero without doubts. The love between them was never spoken outright, and yet it was enough. Letting go does not mean forgetting. It means carrying lightly, like a lantern cupped in the hand, glowing just enough to guide but never meant to be gripped too tightly. This episode became that lantern for many viewers. It gave them a way to hold on to tenderness without needing all the answers. It reminded them that love does not always have to be explained. Sometimes it just has to be felt. Fans who revisited the episode years later often described the same experience. They would sit down, perhaps expecting to analyze it again, but soon they would simply sink into it, allowing the quiet rhythms of the story to wash over them. They realized that it was not a puzzle to solve, but a feeling to experience. In that surrender, they found peace. The act of letting go is in itself a form of love. Rick's character, so guarded and brittle, gave viewers a glimpse of what happens when someone allows even a small piece of themselves to be seen. Morty's patience, his willingness to stay by Rick's side, showed the other side of that truth. The love that remains even when it isn't always easy. For viewers, letting go meant recognizing that these moments were enough. They did not need Rick to say the words. They did not need Morty to become flawless. They only needed to witness the bond as it was, fragile, flawed and deeply human. As the years passed, fans began to see the episode less as a story about Rick and Morty alone, and more as a mirror for themselves. They remembered the people they had cared for, the ones they could not always fix, the ones they sometimes lost. They thought of grandparents, parents, siblings, friends, anyone who had once sat in silence with them, offering love through presence rather than words. This act of remembering became part of the letting go. It was not about clinging to what was lost, but about honoring what remained in the heart. Letting go with love also means accepting impermanence. Shows end. Episodes fade into archives. Characters shift, change, or disappear. And yet the feeling lingers. The memory remains. The love once sparked does not vanish. It changes form. It becomes something quieter, something you carry with you when you close your eyes at night. There is a kind of wisdom in realizing that stories do not have to be endless to be eternal. This episode proved that. By offering a glimpse of love unspoken, it planted something lasting in its viewers. They did not need more. They only needed to remember. At times, fans described the episode as a lullaby, a song without a clear ending, fading into quiet rather than finishing with finality. In many ways, that is the essence of letting go with love. A lullaby does not close a chapter of life. It simply eases you into a new one gently, without force. The episode sang such a lullaby, soothing viewers into reflection rather than demanding resolution. To let go with love is also to accept mystery. The episode never explains everything. It leaves space, quiet gaps where meaning can bloom in the heart of the listener. That openness is part of its gift. Fans realized in time that they did not need every question answered. Sometimes, the unanswered questions are what keep a memory alive. And so, as the legacy of this episode stretches forward, fans continue to carry it, not as a burden, but as a blessing. They recall its softness, its patience, its unspoken love, and they breathe a little easier. They learn in small ways to practice the same in their own lives, to let go of perfection, to let go of the need for control, to simply hold love as it is, even when it is fleeting. This is the quiet heroism the story left behind. Not grand gestures, not victories carved in stone, but a gentle reminder that love, however imperfect, is enough. A reminder that letting go does not mean losing. A reminder that memory, softened by time, can carry us forward. Fans who speak of the episode years later often end their reflections with a sigh, a pause, a silence. They do not always have the words, but they do not need them. Because in the act of pausing, they are already practicing the lesson the episode taught, that silence itself can be full of meaning. That letting go with love is not about speaking, but about feeling. The story then comes to its own soft close. We do not end with a bang or a revelation. We end with a breath, with the acknowledgement that this episode, this memory, has become part of us. It lingers in the heart like the echo of a song long after the notes have faded, and perhaps somewhere in that echo, Rick is still out there, broken, brilliant, stubborn, and strangely tender. Perhaps Morty is still standing by his side, uncertain but steadfast. And perhaps we too are still carrying their bond, folded quietly into our own lives. Stories like this remind us that love does not need to be loud to be real. That letting go does not erase what matters. That memory is in itself a form of holding on, and so with love we let go. And with that he stretched into the stars. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.